The whistle came first. Long, mournful, rolling out over the flat white heat like something already grieving. Then the dust, then the crowd. A woman stood in the middle of all of it, wearing pink silk that had no business existing in a town built of brown wood and browner dust. High collar, fitted sleeves, visible in a way that felt like punishment. A single silver dollar hit the boards near her feet and spun there, flashing obscene in the sunlight before it went still. The crowd did not laugh. They only watched, faces shifting from curiosity to something closer to a verdict. The station master stepped forward, his hand closed around her upper arm. Rough, impatient, across the street, a man loading feed sacks went still. He set the sack down, wiped his hands on his trousers, and walked, boots deliberate against the dust, unhurried, straight toward the woman in pink and the coin still gleaming at her feet. Larkspur, Nevada, 1882. The whistle came first, long, mournful, rolling out over the flat white heat like something already grieving. Then the dust, then the crowd. Su Lin Meng stood in the middle of all of it, and none of it touched her. Not really. She had learned, somewhere over the ocean, somewhere between the last sight of her mother's face and the first sight of this country, how to stand very still while the world moved around her like water around a stone. She wore pink silk, high collar, fitted sleeves, a colour that had no business existing in a town built out of brown wood and browner dust. It had been her grandmother's idea, wear something they will remember. Her grandmother had said, back when there was still a house to say it in, wear something that tells them who you are before you say a single word. So she had worn it, and now the whole platform was staring at her because of it, because that was the thing about pride. It made you visible, and visibility on a day like this was its own kind of punishment. Walter Hargrove had not even taken off his hat. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he's been cheated on. Up, down, mouth already curling before he'd said a word. And when he finally spoke, he didn't speak to her. He passed her, over her. But the crowd that had gathered like they'd been called there on purpose. This is not what was described to me. Su Lin didn't understand every word. She understood the tone. Tone travelled faster than language ever could. Small, he said. Scrawny. He said it like an inventory, like he was returning goods, and no dowry worth mentioning. I was promised a woman who'd bring something to this marriage besides a steamer trunk and a sad face. Somewhere in the crowd a woman laughed, not unkindly, just reflexively. The way people laugh when they don't know what else to do with their discomfort. A man near the ticket window shifted his weight and looked away, suddenly interested in his own boots. A boy of perhaps 10 tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked, too loudly, what the lady had done wrong, and his mother hushed him with a hand on his shoulder and no real answer, because there wasn't one worth giving a child. Hargrove reached into his coat, pulled out a single silver dollar, and threw it. It hit the platform boards near her feet and spun there, flashing obscene in the sunlight before it went still. For your trouble, he said. Then he turned, boarded the eastbound train, didn't look back. The whistle screamed again. Steam hissed white against the blue sky. And the train pulled him away from the wreckage he'd just made, clean and unbothered, like a man who'd only ever done what was reasonable. Su Lin watched the last car shrink into the heat shimmer, a black speck. Then not even that. The crowd was still watching her. She knew what a crowd looked like when it had decided something about you. She'd seen it before, in a different life, when men with official seals had come to her family's restaurant and decided, in the space of an afternoon, that everything her grandfather had built across 2 generations now belonged to the province instead. Crowds had a particular stillness right before they turned into something worse. She recognized it now, the way their faces had gone from curious to something closer to a verdict. Guilty, their faces said. Guilty of being unwanted. It was not a crime, except it felt like one. Standing there, it felt exactly like one. The silver dollar caught the light again, a small bright monument to her humiliation, gleaming up at her from the dust like it thought it was doing her a favor. She did not pick it up. The station master came toward her instead, moustache drooping, face already annoyed before he'd said a word. Can't stay here, miss. He jerked his thumb toward the road out of town. Move along. She didn't move, not because she was being difficult, because she genuinely did not know where along was. There was no along, there was only this platform, and behind her the ocean she'd crossed to get here, and ahead of her a country that had just publicly decided she wasn't worth the price of a train ticket. She held her small cloth bundle against her chest, everything she owned in this brutal new country folded into a square of fabric the size of a loaf of bread. And the station master kept coming. Louder now, hand rising like he might actually take her by the arm. "You deaf girl, I said move along. Can't have you standing here blocking the platform for paying passengers." His fingers closed around her upper arm, not gently, and for one instant something in Su Lin's spine went rigid, some old animal instinct rising up fast beneath the calm she'd worked so hard to hold on to all morning. That was when the wagon stopped moving. Across the street a man had been loading feed sacks, slow work, unremarkable work, the kind of thing a person does with their body while their mind is somewhere else entirely, except his hands had gone still. Because he'd watched the whole thing, the rejection, the silver dollar, the laugh in the crowd that wasn't cruel so much as careless, which was somehow worse. He'd watched it the way you watch a fire start in dry grass, with a low, rising dread, knowing exactly how fast it could spread if nobody stepped on it. His name was Beckett Hollis, and he was not a man who involved himself in other people's business, hadn't been for 4 years. Not since the winter that took his wife and the child who never got the chance to be born, both of them gone inside of 9 days, both of them buried under frozen ground he'd had to break with a pickaxe, because the earth wouldn't soften for grief the way it was supposed to. Her name had been Charlotte. He still thought it sometimes, in the particular quiet, just before sleep, the one time of day his guard came down enough to let her in, Charlotte, who used to hum while she kneaded bread, off-key and unbothered by it. Charlotte, who'd planted a row of sunflowers along the east fence the spring before she died, tall stubborn things that had kept blooming for 2 more summers on their own, like they hadn't gotten word yet that the woman who'd planted them was gone. He'd finally let the frost take them the 3rd year. Hadn't had the heart to plant more. Hadn't had the heart for much of anything, if he was honest, beyond the narrow, grinding work of keeping a ranch alive when the person he'd built it for wasn't there to share it any more. Since her death he came into Larkspur for supplies, for mail, sometimes for nothing at all, just to remember what other voices sounded like. He never lingered. He had no taste left for town gossip, and even less for town cruelty, because he'd had his fill of both the year his life fell apart, and half the county seemed to have opinions about how fast a widower ought to grieve, and a few of them had been unkind enough to say so to his face. But this was different. It wasn't just the rejections happened. People changed their minds about marriages every day, in every county, for reasons good and bad. It was the staging of it, the way Hargrove had turned a private disappointment into a public execution, the way he'd made sure there was a crowd for it, the way he'd thrown that coin like a man closing a business ledger instead of ending another human being's future. And now the station master's hand closing around her arm, rough, impatient, one more small cruelty stacked on top of all the others, as though the whole town had silently agreed that a woman without a husband, and without a coin to her name, simply didn't merit being handled with any care at all. Beckett set down the feed sack, wiped his hands on his trousers, and walked. His boots made slow, deliberate sounds against the dust. Worn heels, unhurried steps. The station master looked up, surprised, when Beckett came to a stop beside the woman in pink. "Ain't your business, Hollis?" Beckett didn't answer him. He looked instead at the hand still wrapped around Su Lin's arm, and something in his expression must have carried more weight than any words could have, because the station master let go without being told to, muttering something under his breath about troublemaking and folks who didn't know when to leave well enough alone. Beckett looked at her instead. Up close, she was smaller than she'd seemed from across the street, pale. Still, but her eyes, when they finally lifted to his, weren't wet with tears the way he'd expected. They were dry, steady, deep water with something moving far beneath the surface where he couldn't see it. He didn't know a word of her language. She, he guessed, knew just as little of his, so he did the only thing he could think to do. He pointed at his own chest. "Beckett," he said. Then he pointed toward his wagon, made a motion like eating from a bowl. Then he pointed at her, made a motion like stirring a pot. Crude. He knew it was crude even as he did it. A grown man standing on a train platform, gesturing like a child playing charades, while half the town watched him do it. But it was the only language he had that didn't require words, And words right now would only get in the way. The station master made a noise of disbelief. "What in blazes are you doing, Hollis?" "Looks to me," Beckett said, not taking his eyes off her, "like she's nobody's problem. And I need a cook." "She's Hargrove Rivers on a train." A few feet away, an older woman in a faded bonnet leaned toward her neighbor and murmured something behind a gloved hand, and though Beckett couldn't hear the words, he caught the shape of them well enough. Poor girl. And then a half-beat later, a slightly different tone. Poor Hollis, taking on more than he knows. Neither judgment sat easy with him, but neither one was going to change what he'd already decided to do. Sulin watched his hands, then his face, searching for something, a trick maybe, or a cruelty dressed up as kindness, because she'd learned by now that kindness could be a costume too. She had worn masks herself, back home, smiling for customers whose money mattered more than their manners. She knew what a performance of decency looked like from the inside. She was trying, in the space of a few seconds, to decide whether this was one. She found none of that in him. What she found instead was a man asking her a straightforward question in the only language available to both of them, a roof in exchange for work, not charity, not pity, dressed up as rescue, a trade. She thought of her mother's voice the last time she'd heard it on a dock half a world away. Survive first, her mother had said, everything else comes after. Sulin gave a single nod, small, almost nothing, but it was enough. Beckett bent down, picked up the silver dollar still gleaming in the dust, and pressed it into the station master's palm. For her ticket, he said, though he knew full well she had no ticket, and nowhere in particular to go, and that the coin wasn't paying for anything except the closing of a ledger that should never have been opened in the first place. He picked up her bundle, turned toward the wagon, didn't look back to see if she was following. He simply trusted that she would. A moment later he heard it, the soft rustle of silk, the light fall of cloth-soled shoes in the dust, coming steady behind him. And something in his chest, something that had been clenched tight for 4 winters, loosened by exactly 1 notch. Not healed, not even close, just loosened, which after 4 years of nothing moving at all felt like an earthquake. The town watched them go. Watched the way a town always watches something it doesn't understand, half judgment, half hunger for a story to carry home to supper. Neither Beckett nor Sulin looked back to see it. A world away, on a different coast, a different ocean, a woman was standing on a different dock, having said the same thing to her daughter 3 months earlier that she would go on saying to herself every night since. Survive first, everything else comes after. Sulin's mother had not known, could not have known. Standing on that dock, watching her only daughter's ship pull away into grey water, that those 5 words would end up being the only compass her daughter carried across an entire ocean and into a country that would try, on the very first afternoon, to throw her away like spoiled goods. But Sulin had carried them anyway, folded them into the same quiet place where she kept everything else that mattered. And she carried them still, climbing up into a stranger's wagon in a country she didn't yet have words for, because a compass doesn't need a destination to be worth keeping. It only needs a direction. Survive first. Everything else comes after. The ride out of Larkspur was quiet in the way that only 2 strangers sharing a wagon seat can be quiet, which is to say, loud with everything unsaid. The mules pulled steady over the rutted road. Heat rose off the earth in visible waves, warping the horizon into something liquid. Beckett kept his eyes on the mules' rumps because it was easier than looking at the woman beside him, sitting with her spine straight as a fence post, hands folded over her bundle like she was praying to something he couldn't name. He didn't know what to say to her, which was fine, because she wouldn't have understood it anyway, except the silence started to feel less like nothing and more like something. A pressure, a held breath that neither of them knew how to let out, so he talked anyway. Not to her exactly, more like around her, the way a man talks to a spooked horse, low and even, to fill the air with something that wasn't threatening. Place ain't much, he said. 10 miles out. Small house. Leans a little to the west. Always has, ever since I built it, and I never did figure out why. He glanced sideways. She was watching the horizon, not him, but her head had turned a fraction of an inch. Listening, maybe, even without understanding. Had a wife, he said, then stopped. He hadn't meant to say that. He hadn't said those 2 words out loud in He tried to count and lost the number somewhere around 3 years, because counting made it worse, made the loss into arithmetic, and arithmetic was the last thing grief needed. Su Lin turned her head another inch. He didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. There are some sentences that finish themselves in the silence after them, and this was one. The wagon rattled on. Sagebrush blurred past in silver-green streaks. A hawk turned slow circles far overhead, patient, riding a column of rising heat, waiting for something small to move in the brush below. Su Lin didn't flinch at the ruts in the road, didn't flinch at the heat, or the dust, or the strangeness of everything around her. She sat like a woman who had already survived worse than a bumpy wagon ride, because she had. She thought, in her own language, in words Beckett would never hear, "I have already lost everything once. This is only the second time. It will not be worse than the first." She did not know yet whether that was true. But she needed to believe it, the way a person needs to believe the ground will hold before they take the next step. She let her mind drift, because a mind that stays too long in the present, on a day like this, is a mind that breaks. So it drifted backward instead, across the ocean, across the months, to the last real kitchen she had ever belonged to, and to the single afternoon that had ended it. It had been a Tuesday. She remembered that clearly, the way you remember small, useless details about the day everything changes, because the mind reaches for something ordinary to hold on to when the extraordinary becomes too much to look at directly. The Tuesday afternoon, the lull between the lunch trade and the evening rush, when her grandfather liked to sit by the kitchen window and watch the street below with a cup of tea he never quite finished. The men had come without warning. Official coats, official seals stamped onto papers nobody in the family had ever seen before, papers that declared, in language too formal for anyone to properly argue with, the province had reassessed the ownership of certain properties, and that the Meng family's restaurant, its building, its land, its generations of accumulated reputation, now belonged to interests the paper did not trouble itself to name. Her grandfather had not shouted, had not begged. He had simply stood very still in the doorway of the kitchen he'd built with his own hands 40 years before, watching strangers walk through it with the particular unbothered efficiency of men who did this sort of thing often enough that it no longer troubled their sleep. Su Lin had been in the pantry when it happened, counting jars of preserved plum, and by the time she came out it was already over, already decided. Her grandfather old and grey in the doorway, her mother's hands, usually so certain, trembling faintly as she reached for a stack of family recipe books that no official seal could technically claim, because paper and ink did not count as property in the same way land did. That night, her mother had sat the whole family down at what remained of their own kitchen table and said, in a voice that did not shake even once, that they still had something worth carrying. Not gold, not land, the one thing no seal or stamp could take from a family that had spent 4 generations perfecting it, knowledge. And 3 months after that, a letter had arrived from a matchmaker's contact in America, describing a merchant named Walter Hargrove, prosperous, respectable, seeking a wife of good family and finer breeding than the frontier towns of Nevada usually offered. It had seemed at the time like the last true stroke of good fortune the family had left. Su Lin thought of her mother's face across that final family meal now, the wagon rattling beneath her, dust rising gold on either side, and found she could not decide whether the woman who had sent her across an ocean toward a man named Hargrove would be more furious at the man for his cruelty, or prouder of her daughter for having survived it without breaking. Both, she decided finally. Her mother had never been a woman who settled for only one feeling when 2 would serve the truth better. The ship itself came back to her too, unbidden, the way certain memories do when the mind has finally decided a person is safe enough to remember them properly. 6 weeks at sea, most of it spent below decks in a berth barely wider than her own shoulders, sharing air with 40 other women bound for lives they hadn't chosen so much as inherited, the way a debt gets inherited, or a name. There had been a storm in the 2nd week, one bad enough that the crew had ordered everyone below and battened the hatches, and Su Lin remembered lying in the dark, listening to the hull groan against water that sounded less like ocean and more like something alive and furious, and thinking, with a strange and total calm that surprised her even at the time, that if the ship went down here, in the middle of all this black water, at least the choosing would be over. At least she would not have to walk off a gangway into a country that had already decided, in letters exchanged months before she'd ever boarded, exactly how much she was worth. She had not said any of this aloud. There had been an older woman in the berth beside hers, a widow named Auntie Fen, travelling to join a nephew's household in San Francisco, who had reached over in the worst of the storm and taken Sulin's hand without being asked, and held it the way her own grandmother used to, firm and dry and entirely unbothered by the shaking of the world around them. Fear is only water finding the cracks you didn't know you had, Auntie Fen had said over the groan of the hull. Better to know the cracks now, better than finding them later when no one is holding your hand. Sulin had never learned what became of Auntie Fen after they docked, the crowds of the port swallowing them into different lines, different papers, different futures, and she found now, sitting in a strange man's wagon on the other side of the country from where that ship had landed, that she still thought of the woman sometimes. Still thought of that dry, steady hand in the dark, holding on through weather neither of them could control. She hoped, wherever Auntie Fen had ended up, that her nephew's household had been kinder than the one Sulin had been promised. The homestead came up slow on the horizon, a leaning clapboard house. A barn, sturdier than the house, because a man builds shelter for his animals with more care than he builds it for his own grief. A corral. A well. Miles of nothing in every direction, broken only by sagebrush and the occasional stubborn juniper that had decided, against all reason, to grow here anyway. This is it, Beckett said, mostly to himself. He helped her down from the wagon seat. His hand brushed the strange smooth fabric of her sleeve silk, out here, in a place that had never once needed to know what silk felt like, and something about the contact struck him as almost violent in its wrongness, like finding a flower blooming out of a crack in sun-baked stone. Beautiful, and completely out of place, and somehow that made it more remarkable, not less. He led her inside. The house was one main room doing the work of three. Kitchen, dining room, living space, if you could call it living, a cold iron stove in the corner, a rough table, 2 chairs, though only one had ever really been used in 4 years. Dust lay over everything in a fine grey film, the kind that settles into a house when nobody has the heart to keep fighting it back. Dirty plates stacked by the wash basin, evidence of a man who worked from sunup to collapse and had nothing left over for the small ceremonies of living. Beckett felt the shame of it rise in him fast and hot. He hadn't thought about how the house would look through someone else's eyes. He hadn't had reason to. Nobody else's eyes had been in this house for 4 years. He pointed at the stove. The pantry, the small back room. "You stay here," he said, gesturing toward it. Then, because he didn't know what else to do with himself, "I'll be in the barn." He needed to leave, needed to give her the room to breathe, to take in this strange new life without a stranger's eyes on her while she did it. Or maybe, and he didn't examine this thought too closely, because examining it felt dangerous, maybe he needed to leave because standing in that room with her felt like standing in a house that had, for one disorienting second, felt less empty than it had in years, and he didn't trust that feeling, didn't trust it at all. He turned, shut the door softly behind him. In the barn he mended a piece of tack that didn't strictly need mending. His hands moved, his mind didn't. What had he done? What had he actually done? Marching across that platform like some kind of fool with a conscience, gesturing at a stranger like a half-wit, bringing a woman he couldn't speak to into a house he could barely stand to live in himself. Because that's what it was, an impulse, a single reckless impulse in a life built entirely out of caution, 4 years of careful, deliberate, controlled nothing, and he'd broken it in about 90 seconds flat because he couldn't stand to watch a man throw a silver dollar at another human being like she was a horse he was returning. Hargrove had money. Hargrove had a lawyer, probably. Hargrove had the kind of pride that didn't let insults like this one lie down quietly, and Beckett had just handed him one, publicly in front of half the town, free of charge. The whispers would start before sundown. They probably already had. And what then? What exactly did he think happened next? He'd taken in a foreign woman who couldn't speak a word of English, a woman who'd just been publicly shamed by one of the wealthiest men in the county, and he had no plan beyond tomorrow's breakfast. He set the tack down, rubbed his face with both hands. Charlotte would have laughed at him. That thought arrived uninvited and sat there anyway, sharp and sudden. She'd have laughed, and then she'd have marched into that house and made the poor woman feel welcome inside of 10 minutes flat, because Charlotte had never once in her life met a stranger she couldn't talk into being a friend by supper time. Beckett had none of that gift. He only had a wagon, a spare room, and the stubborn, unpolished conviction that what Hargrove had done was wrong, and that wrongness, once seen clearly, could not simply be walked past, until he heard something. A sound from the house, not a cry, not a complaint, a fire crackling to life. He looked up, smoke, thin and grey, rising from the chimney into the flat white sky. He went back to work in the barn for another hour, because some stubborn, cowardly part of him needed the hour to talk himself down off the ledge of his own doubt. And when he finally walked back to the house, dust on his boots, uncertainty still sitting heavy in his chest, what he found stopped him cold in the doorway. The stove was lit, a pot of water heating on top, washed, stacked clean and dry by the basin. The table wiped down, the dust that had lived there for years finally, unbelievably gone. And Su Lin was sweeping the floor. The pink silk dress was gone too, replaced by a plain dark tunic and trousers she must have packed in that impossibly small bundle. She looked smaller without the finery, but something else had replaced it, something steadier, more grounded. A woman who moved through a strange kitchen with the quiet, economical certainty of someone who had done this exact motion 10,000 times before, in a different kitchen, in a different life, and had simply carried the knowledge with her across an ocean because it was the one thing nobody could take. She glanced up when he came in. Her expression didn't change. She returned to sweeping. Beckett stood in his own doorway like a stranger. He had offered her a job as a cook. She was already remaking the air of the place. That evening he sat down to a meal that made him question every meal he'd eaten in the last 4 years. From what little he had, salt pork, dry beans, a handful of withered onions he'd been meaning to throw out, she'd made something he didn't have a word for. The pork, simmered slow with some dried herbs she must have carried across an ocean in that bundle, had gone tender and fragrant in a way salt pork had no business being. The beans were rich, layered with flavour he couldn't name and didn't need to. She'd even made a flat, savoury bread on the stovetop, something between a biscuit and nothing he'd ever seen before. They ate in silence. The only sounds were fork against tin, and the fire settling in the stove, and somewhere outside, the wind doing what the wind always did out here, moving across 100 miles of empty land like it owned every inch of it. He watched her eat, deliberate, posture straight, focus entirely on the food in front of her, like eating itself was an act she gave full attention to the way some people pray. There was a dignity in her that 4 years of hard weather hadn't managed to put in him. He'd seen her at the absolute bottom of her life that morning, publicly discarded, humiliated in front of a crowd of strangers. And here she sat, hours later, creating order and something close to beauty out of the wreckage of his kitchen, out of the wreckage of her own morning, like she'd simply decided the humiliation didn't get to follow her home. He began to understand something, slowly, the way understanding arrives when a man's too stubborn to let it in all at once. He hadn't rescued her. He'd hired a force of nature that happened for 1 terrible hour on a train platform to look like a victim. The days folded into a rhythm neither of them had to build. It built itself. Beckett rose before light, headed for the barn, worked until his body ached in the particular way that honest labour aches. When he came back for the midday meal, the house was clean, and something hot and unfamiliar and good waited on the table. In the evenings they ate together in that same careful silence, though the silence had started to feel less like a wall and more like a room they were both learning to sit comfortably in. Slowly they began to trade words. He'd point at something, say the English of it. Table. Water. She'd repeat it back, head tilted, voice soft and careful, testing the shape of each unfamiliar sound in her mouth, like she was tasting it before deciding whether to trust it. The first week, she called the chickens horses, and refused to be corrected for 3 straight days, insisting, with a very serious face, that Beckett was the one who had it wrong. He laughed so hard the first time she pointed at a hen and announced hoarse with complete confidence that he had to sit down on the porch step, and Su Lin, not understanding the joke, but understanding the sound of it, allowed herself the smallest curl of a smile before turning back to the coop, muttering something in her own language that Beckett would have given a week's wages to understand, because it was very clearly not a compliment. There was the evening. A few days later, when Beckett tried eating with the 2 thin sticks Su Lin used instead of a fork, purely to see if he could, and dropped nearly every bite of rice back into the bowl for a full 5 minutes before finally giving up and eating directly out of the bowl with his fingers, which made Su Lin laugh so hard she had to set down her own bowl entirely. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh without catching herself halfway through, without that small guarded pause where she seemed to check whether laughing was allowed. He decided, watching her, that he would happily drop rice on the floor every night for a month if it meant hearing that sound again. There was the afternoon he found her standing perfectly calm over a rattlesnake coiled near the well, not screaming, not running, simply watching it with the same patient attention she gave everything, before she picked up a hoe with slow, unhurried movements and dispatched it with a single clean strike that left Beckett standing frozen 10 feet away, half in awe and half in genuine fear for his own nerves. She'd looked at him afterward, faintly puzzled by his expression, and said only, "In my country, the kitchen has bigger dangers than this," which he decided not to ask her to explain further, at least not that day. A peddler came through in the 4th week, an old, weathered man named Silas, who ran a wagon route between the mining camps and the scattered ranches of the county, selling needles and thread and tin pots and whatever news he'd picked up along the way, which was usually worth more to isolated homesteaders than the goods themselves. He eyed Su Lin with open curiosity when Beckett introduced her, simply as Su Lin, no explanation offered or asked for, and then did the thing most decent strangers eventually did once their curiosity had run its course. He got down to business. "Got cinnamon bark, if you want it," Silas said, digging through his wagon. "Picked it up off a fella doing trade out of San Francisco. Been sitting in my wagon 2 months because nobody out this way knows what to do with it." Su Lin's whole face changed. She came down off the porch steps faster than Beckett had ever seen her move, and the negotiation that followed, conducted in a mix of English, gesture, and an intensity Su Lin brought to very few things besides cooking and rattlesnakes, ended with her trading 2 jars of preserved vegetables and a length of the calico Beckett had brought her weeks before for the entire remaining stock of cinnamon bark, star anise, and a small twist of paper containing something Silas called Chinese 5-spice, though he admitted he had no earthly idea what half the components actually were. "Lady drives a hard bargain," Silas told Beckett afterward with the particular respect one tradesman reserves for another. "You're a lucky man, Hollis. A wife like that'll keep you fed better than any cook in this county, and I've eaten at most of their tables." "She's not," Beckett started, then stopped, because the correction felt smaller and less true than it had a month ago, and he found he didn't especially want to make it. "She's not for hire elsewhere," he said instead, which wasn't quite an answer to what Silas had actually said, but seemed to satisfy them both well enough. Silas promised to come back through with more spice within the season, and true to his word, he did, twice more before the year was out, each visit turning into something between a trade negotiation and a social call, Su Lin peppering him with questions about San Francisco, about whether there were others like her there, whole streets of people who spoke her language and cooked her food, and Silas, to his credit, always answered as honestly as he could, which sometimes meant admitting he didn't rightly know. Then she'd teach him hers, pointing to the small jars of spice she'd unpacked, to the vegetables she was coaxing, somehow, out of a hard patch of dirt behind the house that Beckett would have sworn couldn't grow so much as a weed. He tried once to repeat a word for ginger back to her, and got the tones so thoroughly wrong that Su Lin actually laughed out loud, a real laugh, quick and startled, like it had escaped before she'd given it permission. She clapped a hand over her own mouth immediately afterward, looking almost alarmed at herself, and Beckett found he wanted, more than almost anything, to hear that sound a second time. Say again, she told him, eyes bright with something that hadn't been there the day before. Wrong again. Is funny. Glad my suffering amuses you. Very much, she said, and there was no apology in it at all. She let him try his hand at cooking exactly once, and only because he'd insisted, standing in the kitchen doorway one evening with the particular stubbornness of a man who'd spent 6 years managing without help, and did not entirely believe a task could defeat him simply because he'd never attempted it before. How hard can it be, he said. Watched you do it near every night for 2 months. Watching is not doing, Sulin said, already looking faintly amused, and stepped back from the stove with the deliberate, ceremonial air of a woman clearing space for a disaster she fully expected to enjoy. It was a disaster. He oversalted the beans within the first 5 minutes, then attempted to correct the mistake by adding water, which thinned the whole pot into something closer to grey soup than anything resembling a meal. The bread scorched on one side, while remaining raw on the other, a feat Sulin declared, examining it with real scientific interest, she hadn't previously believed possible. The onions, meant merely to soften, blackened entirely while he was distracted trying to save the beans, filling the small house with a smoke that sent them both out onto the porch, coughing, Sulin laughing so hard she had to lean against the doorframe for support. 4 years, Beckett said, standing amid the wreckage of his own kitchen, disgusted with himself in a way that was mostly performance at this point. 4 years I fed myself off this stove and never once burned it this bad. 4 years you fed yourself beans and salt pork, same thing, every night, no thinking required, but Sulin managed between breaths. This is different. This requires actual attention. You're not helping. I am not trying to help, she said, wiping her eyes. I am enjoying. There is difference. We ate bread from the general store that night. A good loaf Beckett had been saving for Sunday, and Sulin insisted solemnly on keeping the ruined pot of grey bean soup sitting on the stove for 2 full days afterward, unwilling to let him dispose of the evidence before she'd properly finished laughing about it. Never again, Beckett said on the 3rd morning, finally scraping the pot clean. Never again, Sulin agreed. You are better at fences, I am better at food. This is good arrangement. We do not need to be good at same things. No, he said, and found, watching her, that he agreed with the sentiment more fully than the words alone accounted for. Yes, we don't. She had claimed, without asking permission, a small corner shelf near the stove, and over the weeks it had slowly filled with a modest collection of things that meant nothing to anyone but her. A cracked porcelain cup, one of only 2 items from her grandmother's kitchen that had survived the crossing intact. A folded scrap of red paper, brushed with characters Beckett couldn't read, that she touched briefly every morning before she began cooking, the way some men touched a hat brim out of habit more than belief. A single pressed flower from the wildflowers along the fence line, kept flat between 2 pieces of glass she'd fashioned herself out of a broken window pane. Beckett noticed it the way he noticed most things about her, slowly and without commenting on it until enough time had passed that a comment finally seemed welcome rather than intrusive. "What's it for?" he asked one evening, nodding toward the shelf while she worked. "Small altar," Sulin said, not looking up from the pot she was stirring. "For remembering. My grandmother believed a kitchen without memory in it is only a room where food happens, not a real kitchen at all. And this one? Now that you've got your memory in it?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. "Now it is a real kitchen," she said. "First time since the ship." He didn't say anything to that, not right away, but he found himself glancing at the little shelf more often after that conversation, the cracked cup and the folded paper and the pressed flower, understanding that she'd built, out of almost nothing, a small monument to everything the world had taken from her and everything she'd refused to let it take completely. Her garden became its own kind of miracle. She watered it bucket by bucket, hauled up from the well, hour after hour, in heat that would have driven most men indoors. And the ground, stubborn, cracked, red-brown ground that had never once cooperated with Beckett's own half-hearted attempts at a kitchen plot, started pushing up green. She wasn't just cooking, she was making something grow out of a place that had, until she arrived, only ever known how to take things away. Beckett found himself, against every instinct he had, looking forward to coming in from the fields. Wondering what she'd have waiting, he started bringing things back from town, a bag of finer, a few precious potatoes, a length of plain calico fabric, leaving them on the table without a word, because words still felt like walking on unfamiliar ice between them. She'd take the offerings with a small nod, grateful, careful, like she was still deciding whether any of this was going to last. Sulin asked to go into town herself the 6th week, rather than simply wait at home for Beckett to return with whatever news the general store had to offer. He'd hesitated at the request, some old protective instinct rising up before he could think better of it, and she'd read the hesitation on his face plainly enough. "I am not asking permission," she said, not unkindly. "I am telling you my plan, so you do not worry when wagon is gone." He drove her in himself, that first time, waiting outside while she went into the general store alone, and watched through the window as she moved through the aisles with the same careful, deliberate attention she brought to everything, examining goods, counting coins, entirely unbothered by the 2 women near the door who stopped their conversation the moment she walked past them. Jeb Alsop served her without incident, though without much warmth, either at that early stage. She carried her small purchases back out to the wagon with her chin level and her spine straight, exactly the posture Beckett remembered from the train platform. Armor worn not because the danger had passed, but because she'd decided, somewhere along the way, that the armor suited her regardless. It was on the walk back to the wagon that an old woman, one of the few in town who'd never much cared what anyone thought of her opinions, stopped Sulin outright in the street. "You're the one doctoring folks with soup," the woman said. "Not a question." Sulin, uncertain whether this was the opening of an insult or something else entirely, answered carefully, "I have made broth, for a few people, not doctoring, her different." The old woman studied her a long moment, then gave a short, approving nod, the kind old women give when they've decided, finally and irrevocably, that someone has earned a place on the right side of their ledger. "My knees have been giving me the devil for 2 winters running. You come across anything for that in that garden of yours, you let me know. It was such a small exchange. Barely 30 seconds, in the middle of an ordinary street, over nothing more consequential than aching knees." But Sulin thought about it the entire ride home, turning it over the way she turned over English words she was still learning to trust, and Beckett, watching her from the corner of his eye, saw something in her face ease that had been tight since the moment they'd left the house that morning. "Good trip," he said, not quite a question. "Good trip," she agreed. "Small good trip, but I will take small good when it is offered." There was a small rise behind the house, a quarter-mile out past the garden fence, where 2 wooden markers stood weathered grey by 4 winters of wind. Beckett went there alone most Sundays early, before the heat of the day set in, and for the first month Sulin had left him to it without question, understanding instinctively that some griefs needed privacy the way wounds needed air. The first time she followed him, she did it carefully, keeping her distance, carrying nothing but a small bundle of wild flowers she'd gathered from the edge of the property, the same stubborn purple blooms that grew along the fence lines no matter how little rain the summer brought. She stopped a respectful distance behind him and waited, not speaking, until he turned and saw her there. He didn't send her away. She came forward slowly then, and knelt, and laid the flowers at the base of the smaller marker, the one that had no name carved into it at all, only a date, because a child who never drew breath outside the womb had never been given the chance to earn one. "I did not know her," Sulin said quietly, "but I know what it costs to lose a family. I am sorry, Beckett Hollis, for what this ground holds." Beckett stood very still for a long moment, looking at the flowers against the pale wood, something working hard behind his jaw. "Charlotte would have liked you," he said finally, voice rough. "She had a temper about cruelty, couldn't abide it. Would have marched onto that platform herself if she'd been standing where I was, probably before I'd even set the feed sack down. And I am glad," Sulin said, "that some part of her walked onto that platform anyway. Through you." It was, Beckett would think later, the closest either of them had come to saying something neither one was quite ready to say outright. He didn't answer it directly, just nodded, and let her stand beside him a while longer in the thin morning light, the 2 of them quiet together at the edge of a grief that had, for 4 years, belonged to him alone, and now somehow, without either of them deciding it in words, belonged to both of them instead. She came with him most Sundays after that, never spoke much once they arrived. Just stood beside him, a steady, undemanding presence, and Beckett found, over the weeks that followed, that the visits stopped feeling like a wound he was tending alone and started feeling like something closer to remembrance shared between two people who understood, each in their own hard-won way, exactly what it cost to keep loving people the world had already taken. Town, though, hadn't forgotten. When Beckett rode in for supplies a few weeks later, he felt it the moment he crossed onto the main street. The usual gruff hellos had gone cold. Men stopped talking mid-sentence when he walked into the general store. Jeb Alsop, who'd sold Beckett flour and nails for 6 straight years without a single unkind word between them, served him now with a face carved out of stone. Nobody said anything directly, which was, somehow, worse than if they had. He was loading his wagon outside the store when a man stepped out from the shadow beside the saloon, big through the shoulders, tobacco-stained teeth. One of Hargrove's hired men. Everybody in Larkspur knew the type. Men Hargrove kept around for jobs that required muscle instead of manners. Hollis. The man spat a stream of tobacco juice near Beckett's boot, close enough to count as a message. Mr. Hargrove ain't happy. Beckett kept loading the wagon. Didn't stop, didn't look up. You took something that belonged to him. She's a person. Beckett's voice stayed level. Quiet, not a piece of property. That ain't how he sees it. The man took a step closer. Close enough now that Beckett could smell the tobacco and the sweat under it. He wants her back, or he wants what she was supposed to bring him. Beckett straightened, turned to face him fully. Then he can ride out and ask for it himself. The man's jaw tightened. He puffed his chest out the way men did when they wanted a fight, but hadn't quite worked up the nerve to start one. That ain't a good idea, farmer. We can be real persuasive. Beckett didn't tense, didn't reach for the shotgun riding under the wagon seat, though he knew exactly how many seconds it would take to get there if he needed to. He just looked at the man. Steady. Level. The same look he used on a spooked colt. No fear in it, no anger either. Just an absolute stillness that unsettled people far more than shouting ever could, because a man who's already survived losing everything doesn't scare easy anymore. There's not much left to threaten. The silence stretched, long enough that the man's confidence started slipped his 1 degree at a time, until he finally grunted, that again, and backed off toward his partner in the saloon's shade. This ain't over, he called back. Beckett finished loading the wagon without answering. But as he drove out of town, dust rising gold behind the wheels, a cold knot settled low in his stomach. He knew the man was right. This was nowhere near over. Emmett Cade showed up 2 days later. Beckett was mending fence when he saw the rider coming, and something in the shape of the man, the way he sat the horse, hunched slightly forward, hat pulled low even though the sun was behind him, told Beckett who it was before he was close enough to see the face. Emmett Cade, Hargrove's foreman. And 6 years back, before any of that, a 19-year-old ranch hand who Beckett had pulled out of a flash flood on Cottonwood Creek with about 4 seconds to spare, hauling him up onto a rock by the collar while the water tried to take them both. Beckett hadn't thought about that day in a long time. Emmett reined up a respectful distance from the fence, didn't dismount right away. Sat there a moment, hat brim shadowing his eyes, like he was working up to something he didn't want to say. Hollis, Cade, ain't here on Hargrove's business. Emmett shifted in the saddle. Not exactly. Beckett set down his hammer, waited. Because a man who rides 10 miles to say he's not here on business is, more often than not, exactly there on business, just the kind he's ashamed of. You heard what happened at the station, Emmett said. Not a question. I was there. Then you saw the whole show. Something in the way Emmett said the word show made Beckett go still. What do you mean, show? Emmett looked off toward the horizon for a second, jaw working like he was chewing on whether to say the rest of it. Hargrove knew, he said finally, weeks before that train ever pulled in. He had a letter came from her family's contact back east, telling him the family'd lost their money. Lost everything. Weeks, Hollis. He knew weeks before she ever set foot on that platform. Beckett felt something cold settle behind his ribs. Then why'd he wait? Because there was a man on that platform he needed to impress. Emmett's voice had dropped low, almost apologetic, like he hated being the one carrying this. Fella named Prescott, investor out of Sacramento, Been sniffing around a rail deal, a spur line to connect this valley to the main route north, and Hargrove needed Prescott to see him as a man who didn't get taken advantage of, didn't get cheated. So Hargrove made sure it happened loud, made sure it happened in front of a crowd, made sure Prescott was standing right there to see it. Beckett's hands had curled into fists without his permission, because that meant it wasn't disappointment at all. It wasn't even really about the dowry, not the way Hargrove made it sound. It was theatre. A woman's entire life, dismantled in public, staged for an audience of one investor, so a wealthy man could look tougher than he was. "Why are you telling me this?" Beckett said. Quiet. Dangerous quiet. Emmett finally met his eyes. "Because you pulled me out of that creek and never once asked me for a thing in return, and because what he did to that girl, it didn't sit right with me. Hasn't sat right since." He turned his horse before Beckett could answer. "Watch yourself, Hollis," he said, over his shoulder. "Hargrove don't lose face easy, and he's already lost some." Then he rode off, back toward town, and left Beckett standing at the fence line with a new and heavier understanding of exactly what kind of man he'd made an enemy of. He didn't tell Sulin what Emmett had said. Not that night, not the next. Partly because he had no way to explain it, no shared words for investor or state, or the particular cruelty of a man performing another person's humiliation for an audience. And partly, if he was honest with himself, because he wasn't ready to watch her face change when she understood the full shape of what had been done to her. Not yet, but something in him had shifted. The caution he'd been carrying. Some quiet, unspoken hope that this whole business might just blow over. Hargrove's pride would cool the way most men's pride eventually did. That hope was gone now. Because a man who'd stage a woman's public shaming just to impress an investor was not a man who forgot easily, which meant this wasn't over. Which meant Beckett had a decision to make, and he'd apparently already made it 3 weeks ago, without fully understanding the size of it, the moment he'd walked across that platform. The storm came on a Thursday. Rolled in fast off the mountains the way summer storms did out here, clear sky at noon, black wall of cloud by 4, thunder cracking loud enough to rattle the windows by dusk. Rain hammered the roof for 2 hours straight, hard enough that Beckett half expected to find the whole garden washed flat by morning. It wasn't. Su Lin had rigged some kind of covering over the tender shoots, cloth, staked low, angled to shed the worst of the water, and when the storm finally broke, the air outside smelled washed clean in a way the desert almost never smelled. They sat together on the porch steps that evening, a respectful distance between them, the way there always was. 2 mugs of chicory coffee going cool in their hands. The sky had gone a deep bruised purple, first stars starting to prick through, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. 2 months, Beckett thought, 2 months she'd been here. The garden was thriving. The house, his house, the one he'd built with his own hands and then let go to ruin out of grief, felt like something worth coming home to again. And he knew almost nothing about her. He knew she could take next to nothing and make it into something remarkable. He knew she worked from before he woke until after he slept. He knew there was a core of something unshakable in her that he found himself more and more quietly in awe of, but the why of that train platform, the reason Hargrove had thrown her away like a bad debt, that he still didn't have. He found the courage for it in the dark when he didn't have to watch her face while he asked. "Hargrove," he said. The name tasted ugly in his mouth even now. He made a small gesture, pushing something away from himself. "Why?" Su Lin was quiet a long time. Long enough that he thought maybe he'd crossed some line he didn't know was there. Then she spoke. Her English still careful, still finding its shape, but clearer than it had been 3 weeks ago. "He wanted gold." She looked into her mug instead of at him. "My family. No more gold." She set the mug down, went inside. Came back a moment later carrying the small cloth bundle Beckett hadn't seen since the day she arrived, the one she'd been holding, white-knuckled, on that train platform, like it was the only solid thing left in the world. She sat beside him, untied the knot with careful fingers, folded back the cloth, not jewelry, not coins, small silk pouches embroidered, each one no bigger than a fist. She opened the first and tipped a little of a reddish powder into her palm, fragrant even in the cool night air, opened another, dried leaves, tiny star-shaped pods. One after another, she opened them all, and the scent that rose up between them was like nothing Beckett had smelled before. Warm, foreign in the truest sense of the word, and somehow, impossibly, exactly right for this porch, this night, a strange fragile thing growing between them. This, she said, and her voice had gone thick with something Beckett didn't have a name for, was my dowry. She told him the rest slowly, English words mixed with gestures, with pauses where she reached for a word she didn't have and had to build the meaning some other way. Her family had been chefs, not ordinary ones, for generations, cooks of some renown, running a restaurant that had served officials and merchants of standing, the kind of place people travelled to reach. But the political ground had shifted under them, the way it does, without warning and without mercy, and everything her family had built across those generations had been seized in this of a single season. Gone, all of it. What little money remained her family had spent sending her here. To marry a man they knew only through letters and a single handsome photograph. It had been their last hope. And her dowry, the thing she'd carried across an ocean, wrapped in cloth, held against her chest through every mile of the journey, wasn't gold at all. It was knowledge. Recipes passed down through 4 generations, spices rare enough that half of them, Beckett suspected, couldn't be bought anywhere within 500 miles of Larkspur. The accumulated art of a family that had spent 100 years learning how to turn simple things into something worth remembering. A man like Hargrove, a man who measured the entire world in dollars and weighed every person against what they could add to his ledger, that dowry had been worthless, worse than worthless. An insult. He'd expected wealth walking off that train. Instead, he'd gotten a woman whose only fortune was talent, and he hadn't recognized it as fortune at all. He'd seen a liability. Beckett looked at the small pouches spread across the cloth between them, the air thick with 100 years of somebody else's history. He felt a slow, cold fury rise in him toward a man he'd already half decided he despised. And beneath the fury something else, something closer to awe aimed at the woman sitting beside him, who had offered a fortune to a man too blind to recognize it, and who had somehow, impossibly, walked away from that humiliation and built a garden out of cracked desert dirt within 2 months of arriving. He thought of every meal she'd made from almost nothing. He thought of the green shoots pushing up through soil that had never grown a thing for him. He thought of the order she'd brought into a house he'd let fall apart around his own grief. And he understood, finally, exactly what he'd walked into on that train platform without knowing it. "Can you cook?" he asked. Voice barely above a whisper, the same question he'd asked her the first day. Back then it had been practical, almost clumsy, a crude proposition built out of gestures and desperation. Now it meant something else entirely. A single tear traced a line down through the dust on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She looked at him, really looked, the way she hadn't quite let herself do since the day he'd found her, and for the first time since he'd known her. She offered him a small, genuine smile. She nodded. "Yes," she whispered, "I can cook." The word landed between them in the dark, quiet as a held breath finally released, and Beckett understood, with the same slow, certain clarity a man feels when the ground finally stops shifting under him, that whatever came next, whatever Hargrove decided to do about the woman he'd thrown away, Beckett Hollis was not going to stand aside and let it happen. Not this time, not to her, because he'd already lost everything once, and stood by helpless while it happened, unable to fight sickness with a fist or a gun or a hard look across a fence line. This was different. This he could fight. And for the first time in 4 winters, some long-dormant part of him had woken up with something worth fighting for. Larkspur, Nevada, 1882. Word travels faster than a horse out here. Faster than a train some days. Faster than anything except maybe shame, and shame had already done its work on Su Lin Ming once. This time, the word moving through Larkspur wasn't cruel. This time it was something closer to wonder. It started with Cora Norcross. The judge's wife had been sick for 2 years. Stomach trouble that no doctor in 3 counties could name, let alone fix, a slow, grinding pain that had hollowed her out until she barely left her own kitchen, let alone the house. People in town had stopped expecting her to get better. Had started quietly, the way small towns do, expecting the opposite. She heard about the broth before she heard about the woman who made it. Heard it from her housekeeper, who'd heard it from Jeb Alsop at the general store, who'd heard it from a ranch hand who'd eaten at Beckett Hollis's table once and hadn't been able to stop talking about it since. A foreign cook, out past the ridge, made food that did things regular food didn't do. Cora Norcross was not a woman who believed in miracles, except she was also a woman who'd run out of doctors, so she came anyway, rode out in her own wagon against her husband's mild objections, because 2 years of pain had worn down whatever pride might have stopped her otherwise. She arrived at mid-morning, dust-covered and pale, and stood in the yard for a long moment before she could bring herself to knock, because coming here meant admitting, out loud, in front of a stranger, that she had run out of other options. Sulin opened the door before she had to. "You are sick," Sulin said, not a question. She had learned, in her mother's kitchen a lifetime ago, that illness had a smell to it, faint and sour, that no amount of soap could fully wash away. That obvious, is it? Cora tried for lightness. It came out thin. "Come, sit." Cora sat at the rough table, hands folded tight in her lap, and watched this small, composed stranger move through a kitchen that smelled of things Cora had no names for. "I don't quite know why I'm here," Cora admitted mostly to herself. "I don't believe in cures that don't come from a doctor's bag." "Then believe in soup instead," Sulin said. "Soup does not ask to be believed in, only to be tasted." Cora almost laughed. It had been a long time since anything had surprised a laugh out of her. Sulin didn't ask what was wrong beyond that. She watched the way Cora held herself, careful, guarded, one hand pressed flat against her stomach like she was holding something in that wanted out. Watched the grey colour under her eyes. Watched the way she flinched, small and automatic, when she sat down too fast. Then Sulin went to her garden. Came back with roots Beckett didn't have names for. Ground them slowly, simmered them low for hours, in a broth that filled the house with a smell that was somehow both sharp and gentle at once. "What is in it?" Cora asked, watching the pot with open suspicion. "Roots. Ginger. Something my mother called healing what worry has broken." Sulin considered the English a moment, testing it. "You are worried thing. Long time. Worry sits in stomach when it has nowhere else to go." Cora's hand went still against her middle. "How would you know that?" "I do not know your worry," Sulin said simply. "Only that stomach carries what mouth will not say." Cora drank the broth in small sips, wary at first, then less wary. She came back the following week, and the week after that. By the third visit she was walking straight, eating more, laughing, actually laughing, as a sound her own husband later admitted he hadn't heard in longer than he wanted to say out loud. On that third visit she stayed longer than the broth required. Sat at the table while Sulin worked, watching her hands the way Sulin had once watched her own mother's. "You miss home?" Cora quiet. Not quite a question. Sulin's hands didn't stop moving. "Every day, some days less, some days more. Does it get easier?" "No." Sulin looked up, and there was nothing bitter in it, only honest. "It gets different. You learn to carry it in smaller pocket. Still there. Just does not fill whole chest any more." Cora reached across the table, but unexpectedly, and pressed Sulin's hand once briefly, the way one woman does for another when words have run out of road. She left that day with a basket of fresh eggs and a bolt of good wool cloth pressed into Sulin's hands over quiet protest. "You'll take it," Cora said, in the tone of a judge's wife who was used to being obeyed, "or I'll leave it on your porch and drive off before you can argue." Sulin took it, and something in Larkspur, slow, grudging but real, began to shift. Elias Norcross came out to the homestead himself, a week after his wife's third visit, riding alone, without any of the formality he usually carried into a room. He found Beckett at the fence line and dismounted without being asked, which told Beckett something about the man before he'd said a single word. "Mr. Hollis," Norcross extended a hand, plain and direct. "I came to thank you." Or rather to thank Miss Meng, though I suspect she'd deflect the thanks onto her garden instead. "She generally does," Beckett said, shaking the offered hand. "My wife hasn't slept a full night through in 2 years. Norcross's voice caught slightly, an unguarded crack in a man who spent most of his working life carefully guarding everything he said. "Last night she slept 8 hours straight. First time since before she took ill." He looked out over the fence line, toward the garden visible beyond the house, green and stubborn against the brown land around it. I don't know what's in that broth, and frankly, I've stopped caring to ask. I only know I have my wife back, and I intend to remember who gave her back to me." "She'd tell you the roots did the work," Beckett said. "Roots don't sit up half the night listening to a stranger's worries," Norcross said. "I may be a judge, Mr. Hollis, but I'm not so foolish as to mistake medicine for the whole of what's happening in that kitchen." He mounted back up, gathering his reins. "I don't know what troubles are coming your way. Something tells me, given who your wife's former intended is, that trouble is coming regardless of anything either of you do. But you should know you've got at least one man in this county who won't forget a debt easily paid." He rode off before Beckett could find the right words to answer him, and Beckett stood at the fence a long moment turning the exchange over in his mind, because it was the first time since the train platform that a man of any standing in Larkspur had looked him square in the eye and offered something other than suspicion. A harvest social came at the end of that same week, an annual gathering held in the churchyard that half the county turned out for, regardless of which church they actually attended, more a celebration of the season than of any particular faith. Beckett hadn't planned on going. Hadn't gone in 4 years, in fact, because a widower standing alone at the edge of a churchyard full of families tended to draw exactly the kind of pitying attention he'd spent 4 years avoiding. It was Cora Norcross who changed his mind, riding out specifically to insist, in a tone that made clear she considered the matter already settled. "You'll come," she said, standing in the yard with her hands on her hips, like a woman accustomed to winning arguments before they properly started. "Both of you." It's time this town saw Sulin somewhere besides whispered about behind a store counter. Sulin had gone very quiet at the suggestion, and Beckett understood why without needing to ask. A churchyard full of strangers was not so different, in its way, from a train platform full of strangers, than the last time she'd stood in front of a crowd like that. It had ended with a coin thrown at her feet. "You don't have to," Beckett told her that evening. "I know I do not have to." She was quiet a moment, turning something over. "But if I hide from every crowd because of what one crowd did to me, I let that crowd win something it should not get to keep winning." They went. Sulin wore the calico Beckett had brought her, plain and blue and entirely unremarkable, and stood close to his side through the first hour, watching the gathering with the careful, guarded attention of someone counting exits. It was Cora who broke the ice properly, steering Sulin by the elbow toward a table of pies and preserves with the easy authority of a woman who'd decided this introduction was happening whether the rest of the churchyard liked it or not. And it was, oddly enough, a dish of pickled vegetables that did the rest of the work, because Sulin, unable to simply stand and watch a table of unfamiliar food without offering an opinion, mentioned, almost without meaning to, that the brine needed more vinegar and a touch of sugar to balance it properly. The woman who'd made the pickles, a sharp-tongued rancher's wife named Delphine Cross, who was not accustomed to unsolicited criticism of her cooking, turned with an expression that could have gone either way. "That's so," Delphine said. "I'm sorry," Sulin said quickly, retreating half a step. "I did not mean—" "I mean it," Delphine said, already reaching for a spoon. "Show me." What followed was 20 minutes of two women arguing companionably over a crock of pickled beans, Delphine growing steadily more delighted rather than offended, until she declared, loud enough for half the churchyard to hear, that she'd never in her life had a foreigner tell her how to fix her own family recipe and be entirely correct about it. By the time the fiddles started up for the evening dancing, Sulin had been folded into 3 separate conversations about preserving techniques, had traded her cinnamon bark knowledge for the location of a wild herb patch 2 women swore by for fever, and had laughed twice, loud enough that Beckett heard it across the churchyard and felt something in his chest go warm and unguarded in a way he hadn't expected a church social to accomplish. They didn't dance that night. Neither of them knew the steps well enough to risk it in front of a crowd. But they stood at the edge of the dancing together, close, not quite touching, and watched the town move through its familiar rhythms, and for the first time since the train platform, Beckett watched Sulin's shoulders sit loose and unguarded, the way a person's shoulders sit when they've stopped bracing for the next blow. "Not so bad," she said eventually, watching 2 small children chase each other between the dancers' legs. "Told you. You did not tell me anything. You said I did not have to come. Same thing, Beckett said, and she laughed again, easy this time, unguarded, and he decided, watching her, that he'd happily sit through every church social in the county for the rest of his life if it kept producing that particular sound. Beckett noticed the shift elsewhere too, at the general store first. Jeb Alsop, who'd served him with a face carved from stone for weeks, slipped an extra bag of coffee beans into his order without charging for it. Didn't say why. Didn't need to. On the house, Jeb muttered, not quite meeting his eyes. Then, quieter, almost like a confession, heard what she did for the judge's wife. Beckett didn't push. He'd learned, over the last 2 months, that this town gave things back the way it took them away, slowly, sideways, without ever quite admitting what it was doing. But it was giving something back, and that mattered. Except gratitude, Beckett was starting to understand, travelled at exactly the same speed as resentment, which meant that somewhere across town, in an office with good furniture and a view of the street, Walter Hargrove was hearing the same stories. And a man like Hargrove did not enjoy watching a woman he'd publicly discarded become the most talked-about person in Larkspur for reasons that had nothing to do with him. Before Coltrane ever rode out to the homestead with his banknote and his threats, he tried a different approach. First, one Beckett wouldn't learn about until well after the fact. Su Lin had gone into town alone that particular Tuesday morning, a now familiar errand, and had been standing at the counter of the general store counting coins for a sack of flour when Coltrane happened to be leaving the land agent's office next door and spotted her through the window. He came in with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who assumed every conversation would go his way eventually. Miss Meng. He tipped his hat, the gesture somehow managing to feel more like mockery than courtesy. I understand congratulations may be premature, given the circumstances, but I did want to offer my professional opinion as one interested party to another. I do not require your opinion, Su Lin said, not looking up from her coins. You might, before this is finished. Coltrane leaned against the counter, unbothered by the dismissal. Mr. Hargrove is a patient man, but patience of that particular kind tends to have limits. You would do well to encourage Mr. Hollis toward a reasonable settlement before matters proceed somewhere less comfortable for everyone involved. Su Lin finished counting her coins, set them on the counter, precise, unhurried, then looked up at Coltrane directly, her English steady in a way it hadn't been steady even a month earlier. I have crossed an ocean, she said, leaving behind everything my family built across 4 generations because men with official seals decided our work belonged to them instead of us. I know exactly what patient men like you look like, Mr. Coltrane. I have watched them walk through my grandfather's kitchen with the same calm you are wearing now. She picked up her flower, tucking it against her hip. We'll find Mr. Hollis and I are not so easily walked through as that kitchen was. Good day. She left him standing at the counter, and Jeb Alsop, who'd witnessed the entire exchange from behind his register without saying a word, found himself, for reasons he couldn't fully explain even to his own wife that evening, considerably more inclined toward Beckett Hollis's side of things than he had been that same morning. Coltrane didn't mention the encounter when he rode out to the homestead the following week, but something in his manner that day, a certain deflated caution beneath the practiced politeness, suggested the exchange had lingered with him rather more than he cared to admit. He arrived on a Tuesday. Beckett remembered it was a Tuesday because he'd been mucking out the barn, and there was something almost funny about meeting a lawyer with manure still on your boots. Coltrane didn't dismount, sat his horse like a man who considered the ground beneath him slightly beneath his dignity, hat tipped just enough to suggest politeness without actually offering any. Mr. Hollis, a pause calculated for effect. I represent Mr. Hargrove's interests in this county. Didn't ask what you did for a living. No. Coltrane's mouth curved. Thin and practiced, you didn't. Su Lin had come to stand in the doorway, not hiding, not stepping forward either. Just present, the way she'd learned to be present in rooms where men discussed her like she wasn't in them. Mr. Hargrove, Coltrane went on, is a reasonable man. He recognizes his reaction, at the station, may have been hasty. Hasty. Beckett let the words sit there a moment. That what you're calling it? Prepared, Coltrane said, ignoring him, to overlook your impetuous conduct, and to compensate you generously for your trouble. He reached into his coat, produced a folded banknote, held it out like a man offering a treat to a dog he didn't fully trust. $200, Mr. Hollis, for your inconvenience. Beckett almost laughed. $200 was more money than he cleared in a year. It was a fortune out here. It was also, in the exact same breath, the single most insulting sum anyone had ever offered him. "She's not for sale," he said. "Don't be a fool." Coltrane's polite mask slipped, just for a second, just enough to show the man underneath it. "Mr. Hargrove has friends at the District Land Office in Carson, friends who could take a very close interest in your homestead claim. Improper filings happen, Mr. Hollis. Improvements go unrecorded. Paperwork gets misplaced." He smiled again, and this time it didn't pretend to be friendly. "He can make your life very difficult." There it was, not fists, not guns, paper. The quiet, bloodless weapon of powerful men. Beckett had faced down a man with a knife once, years back, over a dispute about fence lines, and he'd known exactly how to read that danger, the set of shoulders, the grip on the handle, the moment before the lunge. This was different. This danger wore a suit and smiled while it worked, and Beckett had no idea, standing there in the yard with manure on his boots, how you were supposed to fight something like that. He looked back at Su Lin. Her eyes were steady on him, not pleading, not afraid exactly, just watching, the way she watched everything, waiting to see what kind of man he'd turn out to be when the cost of doing right actually came due. "Tell Hargrove," Beckett said, turning back to Coltrane, "he's not welcome on this land. Not now, not ever, and you can get off it too." Coltrane's face went tight and red at the edges. "You'll regret this, Mr. Hollis." He wheeled his horse and rode off, kicking up a spray of dust that hung in the air long after he'd gone, gold and slow settling in the afternoon light. Beckett watched until the rider disappeared over the ridge. Then he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Because he'd just refused $200 and made an enemy of a man who apparently had friends at the land office, which meant this wasn't a threat anymore. This was a countdown. The letter came 3 weeks later. Official government stationery, the seal of the United States Land Office stamped crooked in the corner, like even the clerks who'd handled it couldn't be bothered to care much about a small homestead claim out past Larkspur. Beckett read it twice standing in the yard before the words fully landed. A formal challenge to his claim, filed by an anonymous party, citing improper filing procedures, citing failure to make required improvements to the land within the mandated timeframe set by the Homestead Act, which was, Beckett thought, staring at the paper like it might rearrange itself into something less damning if he looked hard enough, a lie built entirely out of technicalities. He'd built a house, dug a well, fenced 200 acres with his own 2 hands over 6 back-breaking years. He had improvements, he had proof, except proof in a fight like this wasn't the same thing as winning. Proof needed paperwork, witnesses, time and money for a lawyer he didn't have and couldn't afford. Going up against a man who apparently kept lawyers the way other men kept dogs. He folded the letter, put it in his coat pocket. For the first time since the train platform, felt something close to real fear settle into his chest. Not for himself exactly. For her. Because if he lost this land, he lost everything he had to offer her. The house. The garden she'd built out of nothing. The one steady thing either of them had managed to construct since their separate worlds had both come apart. He didn't tell her that night. Told himself he was protecting her from worry she couldn't do anything about, which was, if he was honest with himself, mostly a lie he was telling to protect himself instead. She found the letter anyway. 2 days later, doing the wash, she found it folded in his coat pocket. She couldn't read every word of the formal language, all sharp official English full of terms she didn't have yet. She understood enough. Claim, challenge, land office. She understood, more than the words. The look that crossed Beckett's face when he found her holding it that evening, caught somewhere between guilt and a kind of exhausted relief that he no longer had to carry it alone. "You should have told me," she said. Her English had grown steadier over the weeks, but the words still came careful, deliberate, each one placed like a stone in a stream she was crossing. "Didn't want you carrying it. I already carry it." She set the letter down on the table between them, flat, like laying down a card in a game neither of them had asked to play. "This land, my garden too, my home too. You do not carry alone what is also mine." Beckett didn't have an answer for that, not right away. because she was right, and he knew it, and admitting it meant admitting something else underneath it, that somewhere in the last 2 months, without either of them naming it out loud, this had stopped being an arrangement between Arantxa and his hired cook. It had become something with both their names on it. It was Su Lin who raised the subject of the shotgun, not Beckett. She found him cleaning it on the porch one evening, methodical, quiet, and instead of retreating inside the way she might have a month earlier, she sat down on the step beside him and watched. "Teach me," she said. Beckett looked up. "Teach you what?" "This," she nodded at the gun. "If men come in dark again, I do not want only to run to garden and hide behind fence post." He studied her a long moment. Something in him resisted the idea instinctively, an old-fashioned reflex he couldn't fully name, before he recognized it for what it was, not doubt in her capability, but a reluctance to admit how much danger they were actually standing inside of. "It ain't like chopping vegetables," he said finally. "Kicks harder than you'd expect. I have chopped bone with dull knife in cold kitchen at 5 in morning," Su Lin said, entirely unbothered. "I think I can manage kick." He almost smiled despite himself. He spent the better part of an hour showing her how to load it, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel at a fence post 50 feet off. Her first shot went wide, kicking up dust well past the post. She staggered half a step from the recoil, more surprised than hurt. Her second shot clipped the edge of the wood. Her third hit dead center, and she turned to him with an expression of such fierce, quiet satisfaction that Beckett felt something in his chest twist pleasantly sideways. "Again," she said. "You'll bruise your shoulder. You keep at it like that." "Then I bruise it." She was already reloading, hand steady, focused, entirely serious. "I did not survive ocean and train platform to be helpless woman waiting behind door. If trouble comes to this land, I meet it standing, not hiding." He didn't argue with her again. Some part of him, watching her reload with that same fierce concentration she brought to a simmering pot, understood there wasn't an argument in the world that was going to talk her out of stone beside him instead of behind him. Sheriff Garrett Voss rode out the day after the claim challenge letter arrived, unannounced, and Beckett met him at the fence line with the particular wariness a man develops after weeks of unwelcome visitors. Voss was not built like a man who enjoyed confrontation. He was lean, grey at the temples, with the tired, patient eyes of someone who'd spent 20 years keeping a rough county from tearing itself apart and had grown skilled at doing it without raising his voice. "Heard about the letter," Voss said, without preamble, "and heard about Hargrove's man giving you trouble outside the general store a few weeks back. News travels. It's a small county, Hollis." Voss dismounted, looking out over the fence line at the garden beyond, visible even from a distance, a stubborn green square against the brown land. "I'm not here to take sides in a land dispute. That's the judge's business, not mine. But I want it understood, by you and by anybody else who might be listening somewhere they shouldn't, that threats and trespass are my business, regardless of who's making them." Comforting, Beckett said, and meant it mostly. Wasn't offering comfort, offering fact. Voss's eyes moved toward the house, toward Su Lin visible briefly in the doorway before she withdrew to give the men privacy. That woman been threatened directly, beyond what already happened at the station? Beckett hesitated, weighing how much to say. Coltrane's made noise about the land office. Hargrove's man made noise about wanting her back, or wanting what she was supposed to bring him. Voss's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Noise is one thing. Anybody sets foot on this property with intent to harm either of you, that stops being noise and starts being my problem to solve, and I solve problems a good deal more directly than Mr. Hargrove's lawyer solves his. He remounted, gathering his reins. "I can't watch this property around the clock, Hollis. County's too big and I'm one man, but I'll be riding past more often than I used to, and you send word the moment anything feels wrong. Don't wait for it to become undeniable first. By then it's usually too late to matter." He rode off, and Beckett stood at the fence a long while, turning the visit over. It wasn't protection, not really, not in any way that could stop a fire from being set in the dead of a storm. But it was something. One more person in the county who'd looked at the situation plainly and decided, without being asked, which side of it he intended to stand on. Emmett Cade came back on a moonless night, which told Beckett everything he needed to know about how careful the man was being. He didn't ride up to the front of the house. came around the back, near the barn, and Beckett only knew he was there because one of the horses nickered low and uneasy in the dark. Cade. Beckett stepped out with a lantern, shotgun broken open over one arm, more out of habit than suspicion. Didn't expect you twice in one season. Wish I wasn't here at all. Emmett's voice was low, tight. He glanced back over his shoulder toward the road like he expected to see someone following. Got maybe 10 minutes, Hollis. And I need to be back before anybody notices my horse missing, then talk. Emmett dismounted, didn't come closer, stood in the lantern light with his hat in his hands, turning it slow between his fingers, the way a man does when he's about to say something he can't take back. That claim challenge, he said. It ain't about the girl. Not really. It never was. Beckett felt his stomach tighten. Then what is it about? Rail line. Emmett said the words like they tasted bad. Prescott, the investor from Sacramento, the one Hargrove was showing off for at the station, he's putting together money for a spur line to connect this valley to the main route north. Needs a path through the pass. Your land sits square in the middle of the only stretch wide enough for it. The pieces clicked together in Beckett's head, fast and cold. He never wanted her back, Beckett said slowly. He wants my land. Wants both, probably, if he can get 'em. Emmett's jaw worked, but the land's the real money. The girl was just theatre, a way to look strong in front of Prescott. But once he saw where your homestead sat on the survey map, that's when the claim challenge started. Beckett was quiet a moment, studying the man in front of him. 6 years he'd known Emmett Cade only from a distance, a nod across a fence line, a name attached to Hargrove's operation. He realized, standing there, that he'd never once asked the man a single question about his own life. "Why do you still work for him?" Beckett asked, "if it sits this wrong with you." Emmett's laugh had no humor in it. Same reason most men do what they don't want to. Bills. A sister back in Ohio who needs money sent home twice a year. Hargrove pays well, when he pays at all, and jobs like mine don't grow on every fence post in this county. He looked down at his hat again. Doesn't mean I have to like every order I follow. Just means I haven't found the nerve yet to walk away clean. Takes nerve to ride out here in the dark and tell me what you just told me. Maybe. Emmett didn't look convinced. Or maybe it's just easier to be brave in small pieces than all at once. Tell a man his enemy's plans in the dark, ride home before anybody's the wiser. That ain't the same as standing up in daylight and saying, "I quit." It's a start, Beckett said. Emmett met his eyes for a long moment. Yeah. Well, we'll see how much starting a man can stand before it costs him everything. He put his hat back on, turned toward his horse. "There's more," he said, not looking back. "Prescott's coming out again next month. Final look at the route before he commits his money. If Hargrove can show him a clean claim, land free and clear, no complications, the deal closes. If he can't, he let the sentence hang there, unfinished, the way Beckett had left his own sentence unfinished on that first wagon ride, weeks and weeks ago now. Watch your fences, Hollis, Emmett said, and watch your barn. A man that desperate for a deal to close don't always wait for the courts to decide things his way." He rode off into the dark, and Beckett stood there a long moment with the lantern burning low in his hand, the shotgun still broken open over his arm, useless against the kind of threat that had just ridden away from him. Prescott came through the valley 2 weeks later, exactly as Emmett had warned, though neither Beckett nor Sue Lin knew it at the time. He rode the survey route with Hargrove and a hired engineer, tracing the proposed line along the pass, and the route, as it happened, ran close enough to the homestead's northern boundary that the 3 riders passed within clear sight of the property without ever once approaching it directly. Sue Lin was in the garden when she noticed them, 3 unfamiliar men on the ridge above the north pasture, pausing to study something on a rolled map before moving on. She mentioned it to Beckett that evening, more curious than alarmed. "Surveyors," Beckett said grimly, once she'd described the direction they'd been riding. "Has to be. Emmett said Prescott'd be coming through. He did not stop. Did not speak to us. Wouldn't expect him to. Man like that keeps his hands clean of the details. Lets Hargrove do the dirty work while he stands back and decides whether the numbers look good enough to risk his money." Beckett's jaw had gone tight. Means the deal's still alive. Means we're still standing in the middle of it, whether he bothered to introduce himself or not. Sue Lin was quiet a moment, looking north toward the ridge where the riders had passed. Strange, she said finally, to have your whole life decided by man who does not even trouble himself to look you in the eye while deciding it. Story of my whole 4 years with Hargrove's kind, far as I can tell, Beckett said. Men who move mountains without ever once getting dust on their boots. Then we make sure, Sulin said, this is the mountain that does not move so easily as he expects. He told Sulin everything that night. All of it, the railroad, the investor, the land sitting under both their feet like the real prize in a game neither of them had known they were playing. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet a long moment, staring at the fire. So she said finally, not about dowry, not about me, not enough. No, about land, about money, about she searched for the word, frustrated when it didn't come fast enough, about men who see people like pieces on a board, not people. Pieces, yeah, Beckett's voice was rough. That's about the size of it. She looked at him then, something hard and clear, settling into her eyes. Then we do not let him win the board. What neither of them could see, sitting together in that kitchen, turning over ledgers and fears, was the mirror version of that same conversation happening across town in an office with good furniture and a view of a street that no longer greeted its owner with the deference it once had. Walter Hargrove had built his reputation the way most men in his position built theirs, carefully, over years, one favour extended and one debt collected at a time, until the whole county owed him something and knew better than to say so aloud. He had never once, in all those years, needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted. Money did the raising for him, but money he was beginning to understand with a cold, gnawing unease he did not care to examine too closely, could not undo a story, once a town decided to start telling it differently. And Larkspur, infuriatingly, had started telling a different story about him, the moment that foreign woman had started curing the judge's wife with nothing but roots and patience. He'd heard about the church social from 3 separate sources by the following Monday, each account more insufferable than the last. Delphine Cross praising a stranger's pickling technique in the middle of his own barber's chair, of all places, as though the entire county had collectively forgotten who that woman had been standing beside on the train platform when he'd made his position on her perfectly clear. Forget, he told Coltrane, more to convince himself than his lawyer. Towns like this have short memories. Give it a season. With respect, Walter, Coltrane said, in the careful tone of a man choosing his words around a client whose temper had grown considerably shorter in recent weeks, I'm not certain that's the pattern I'm observing. If anything, sentiment appears to be hardening in the opposite direction. Hargrove said nothing to that, simply stood at his window, looking down at a street that had once tipped its collective hat to him without being asked, and felt for the first time in longer than he cared to admit the particular cold panic of a man watching something he'd assumed was permanent begin, slowly and then all at once, to slip through his fingers. It was that panic, more than any calculated strategy, that would end up driving what came next. Desperate men rarely choose their worst decisions carefully. They simply reach for whatever's closest to hand when the walls start closing in, and coal oil, as it happened, was closer to hand than Hargrove would ever be willing to admit in daylight. The days that followed carried a different weight than the ones before them. Beckett walked his fence lines twice a day instead of once, kept the shotgun closer than he used to, propped by the door instead of racked in the barn. Slept lighter, if he slept at all, one ear tuned to every shift in the wind, every unfamiliar sound carried across the dark flat land. Sulin worked the garden with the same steady focus she brought to everything, but Beckett noticed she had started keeping a small ledger of her own. Dates, notes, some in English, some in careful brushstroke characters he couldn't read. When he asked about it, she held it up like evidence. Proof, she said. How long garden here, how much grow, how much land used. Her mouth firmed into something almost like a challenge. If they say land not improved, I show them wrong. It was such a simple thing, a notebook. Dates and yields and small careful drawings of what had been planted where. And it was, Beckett realized, watching her write in it by lamplight that evening, exactly the kind of stubborn, practical defiance that had gotten her across an ocean in the first place. She didn't fight the way he fought, with fists half curled and a shotgun by the door. She fought with documentation, with patience, the quiet certainty that if you built something real enough, thorough enough, eventually even a rigged game had to reckon with the evidence. He thought, watching her, that he'd never in his life met anyone who turned survival into an art form the way she did. The fence line came first, a smaller warning that neither of them fully understood the size of until later. Beckett found it on his morning walk. A full section of the north fence cut clean through, wire coiled back on itself, like something had deliberately unwound it rather than simply broken it. 6 head of cattle scattered a half-mile out into open range before he managed to round them back in. Cost him the better part of a day, mending wire and chasing stock, and by the time he finished he was too tired and too angry to do much more than stand at the repaired fence line and stare out at the empty land beyond it, wondering how long Hargrove intended to keep testing the edges of what he was willing to do before he committed to something worse. He didn't tell Sulin it had been deliberate. Told her a section had simply given way, old wire finally failing the way old wire sometimes did, and watched her accept the explanation with a carefulness that told him she didn't entirely believe it, but had decided, for reasons of her own, not to push. She pushed 2 days later instead, finding the cut wire herself while walking the fence line with a basket of kitchen scraps meant for the chickens, examining the clean, deliberate edge of it with the same focused attention she brought to reading a recipe. "This is not old wire failing," she said, when Beckett came to find her standing over it. "This is cut with tool. I have seen enough kitchen knives to know the difference between a blade's edge and a rope simply wearing through." Beckett didn't bother denying it. "Didn't want to worry you over a fence line. I would rather worry over truth," Sulin said, "than feel safe inside a lie." She straightened, looking out over the same empty land he'd stared at 2 days before. "This is message, small message, testing how far he can reach before we notice." We noticed. Yes, her jaw set, that same fierce stillness he'd come to recognize whenever she decided a line had been crossed. Now we watch closer. Fence line, barn, well, everything he might reach with a small message before he tries something larger. They walked the whole perimeter together that evening, checking every strand of wire, every post, and found nothing else disturbed, though the search itself did little to ease the particular unease that had settled over the homestead since, a sense that the ground beneath them, however hard-won and legally sound, had become something that needed watching now, day and night, the way a person watches a pot that's shown signs of boiling over before. The storm rolled in on a night in late September, the kind of storm the high desert throws without warning. Clear at sundown, black wall of cloud by full dark, wind coming down off the mountains hard enough to rattle the shutters loose from their hinges. Beckett had been half asleep in the chair by the stove, shotgun across his knees, when the first crack of thunder split the sky wide open. Then came a second sound. Not thunder, horses, screaming. He was up and moving before the thought fully formed. Boots on, door thrown open into a wall of rain and wind, and there, through the sheeting dark, orange light. Flickering, growing, the barn. Fire chewing fast through dry timber and hay, and against the black roar of the storm it looked almost beautiful for one horrible second before his mind caught up to what it meant. "Fire!" His voice tore raw against the wind. "Sulin, the barn's burning!" She was already at the door behind him, and for one frozen instant they both just stood there, staring at the flames climbing the barn's near wall, orange light dancing wild across the falling rain. They moved. Beckett ran for the corral first. 3 horses screaming and rearing against the smoke, and he threw the gate wide, slapping their flanks hard to send them bolting out into the storm and safety, away from the heat and the panic and the smell of char in the wind. One horse reared close enough that a hoof caught his shoulder, a glancing blow, spinning him half around, and he tasted blood where he'd bitten his own tongue. He didn't stop, couldn't stop, because behind him, through the smoke and the driving rain, he heard Sulin's voice. It wasn't calling for help. It was calling out a single word, over and over, desperate, "Ledger!" He turned, and what he saw stopped his heart cold in his chest. She was running toward the barn, toward the fire. Not away from it. Sulin, no, she didn't stop, didn't even slow, because the ledger, her careful, painstaking proof of years and months and seasons of work on this land, the one thing that stood between them and losing everything to a rigged legal challenge. Inside, the small tack room near the front, where she'd taken to storing it safe from weather. Except now the weather wasn't the danger. The fire was. Beckett's boots hit the mud hard, chasing her, his shoulder screaming where the hoof had caught it, smoke thick enough now to burn his throat raw with every breath. Out on the road, a lantern bobbed through the rain. Someone's neighbor, a rancher named Otis Pruett, who lived 2 miles east and had seen the glow against the low clouds, riding hard toward the light with a water barrel lashed behind his saddle. He'd reach them within minutes, too late to save the barn, but soon enough to help keep the fire from spreading to the house. And later Beckett would think, more than once, about how a stranger's decision to saddle a horse in the middle of a storm had likely saved everything else they owned. Get back. Beckett's voice cracked, more prayer than command. It's not worth it. She was already inside. The next several seconds stretched out, long and terrible, the way seconds do when everything that matters is happening somewhere you can't see. Flames climbing the far wall, smoke pouring black out the open door. And Beckett standing there, helpless, screaming her name into a fire that had already taken so much from him once before, 4 years ago, in a different kind of burning, and he would not stand by and lose another person to something he couldn't fight. He went in after her. Smoke rolled thick and choking, heat pressing against his skin like a hand shoving him back. Through the haze he saw her, small, coughing, one arm wrapped around the ledger, clutched tight against her chest, the other hand pressed against her mouth against the smoke. "Got it," she gasped. "I have it." A support beam cracked somewhere above them, sudden and violent, and Beckett didn't think. He grabbed her, one arm hard around her waist, hauling her off her feet, and ran. They broke out through the door into the driving rain, just as the beam gave way behind them with a groan like something dying, sparks exploding upward into the storm. They hit the mud together, hard, rolling once, and for a moment neither of them moved. Just lay there in the freezing rain, chests heaving, rain hammering down on faces streaked with soot and smoke, the barn behind them collapsing slow and orange into the wet dark. Otis Pruett reached the yard moments later, already shouting for buckets, and between the three of them and the last of the storm's own rain, they kept the fire from ever reaching the house at all. Beckett rolled onto his side, looked at her. "You could have died." His voice broke on the words, rougher than he meant it to be, rougher than he'd let himself sound in 4 years. "For a notebook. You could have not notebook." She was still clutching the ledger against her chest, rain running down her face, mixing with something that might have been tears, or might just have been smoke stinging her eyes. Proof, only proof we have. He noticed then the way she was cradling her other hand against her body. "Careful. Wrong. You're hurt." She looked down at it like she was only just now discovering it herself, a burn along the back of her hand and up her forearm, red and already blistering where she must have brushed against something on her way out. "It is nothing," she said, which was, Beckett understood immediately, a lie, the kind of lie people tell when they've spent their whole life learning not to be a burden to anyone. "It's not nothing." He was already pulling her up, one arm around her, guiding her back toward the house through the last of the driving rain. "Come on. Inside. Now." He tended the burn at the kitchen table by lamplight, hands not quite steady, while the storm wound down outside to a steady drumming rain, and the barn's dying fire hissed and smoked in the wet dark beyond the window. Otis Pruett had stayed just long enough to be sure the danger had passed, refused any thanks beyond a nod, and ridden home soaked to the bone, the way neighbors did out here, when the alternative was watching a fire spread unchecked across dry range that could just as easily have been his own. Sulin sat still while Beckett worked, watching his face more than her own hand. "You went in after me," she said quietly. "I wasn't going to let you burn for a book of numbers. Not just numbers." Her voice was soft. "Careful, you went in the fire, same as you came off wagon that day. Same as you look at man who threatens you and do not blink. A pause. You do not run from things, Beckett Hollis. Even when running is smart." He finished wrapping the burn in clean cloth, didn't answer right away. Because she'd put her finger on something he hadn't examined too closely himself, the way he'd charged into a burning building without a second's hesitation for a woman he'd known less than 3 months, when for 4 straight years before that he hadn't been willing to risk his heart on so much as a conversation with another living soul. "Ran from plenty," he said finally, quiet. "Just not from fire. Guess I never learned how." She looked at him a long moment. Firelight from the stove caught the wet shine still on her lashes, the soot still smeared along her jaw, and something passed between them that neither one of them had a name for yet. Something too new, too fragile, to survive being spoken out loud just yet. "Thank you," she said instead, simple, steady, "for not letting me burn alone." He held her bandaged hand a moment longer than the task required. "Wasn't going to happen," he said, "not while I'm standing." She woke some time past midnight, gasping, one hand already reaching for a ledger that wasn't there because it was sitting safe on the kitchen table where she'd left it. The dream had not been about the barn at all, not really. It had been about the restaurant, about her grandfather standing frozen in a doorway while strangers walked through everything he'd built, except in the dream the strangers had carried torches instead of official papers, and the fire had taken the whole building down around her before she could save so much as a single spice pouch. Beckett found her sitting bolt upright in the dark, chest heaving, and didn't ask what the dream had been. Simply sat down on the edge of the narrow bed in the back room, careful of the distance that had always sat between them, and waited the way he'd learned to wait for her, without pushing. "It was not this fire," she said finally, once her breathing had slowed. "It was the other one. The one with papers instead of flame." She pressed the heel of her uninjured hand against her eyes. "I thought I had put it away. Small pocket, like I told your friend's wife. Not filling whole chest." "Some things don't stay in the pocket," Beckett said, "not permanently. They just wait for a night like tonight to climb back out. You know this?" "4 years of nights like tonight," he admitted, quiet. "Charlotte's fever came back to me in dreams longer than I'd like to say. Still does now and again." Sulin was quiet a moment, considering that. "Does it get easier?" "No," Beckett said, echoing, without either of them quite realizing it, the exact answer she'd once given Cora Norcross across a different kitchen table. "Gets different. You learn to wake up from it faster, is about the size of it." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, tired and thin but real. "We are both very good," she said, "at surviving things that should have broken us. Maybe not so good at admitting what it costs." "Maybe," Beckett agreed. "Working on it, though. Both of us." He stayed until she fell back asleep, sitting in the dark on the edge of a bed that wasn't his to sit on, watching over a woman who had, in the space of a few short months, become the thing he most needed to protect in a world that had already taken so much from both of them. He didn't examine too closely what that meant. Some truths he was learning didn't need to be named to be true. They only needed tending, the way a garden needed tending, patient and steady, until eventually, without any single dramatic moment marking the change, they simply became impossible to ignore. Morning came grey and smoke-smelling, the barn a smouldering black skeleton where a structure had stood the night before. Beckett walked the wreckage slow, boots crunching over char and ash, looking for what he already suspected he'd find. He found it near the west wall, a trace of coal oil, unmistakable even under the rain-soaked ash. Patch of ground outside the fence line, boot prints pressed deep into mud that had been soft the night before and had since dried hard enough to hold the shape. Not lightning, not accident. Someone had set that fire, deliberate. Timed for a storm, loud enough to cover the sound of a man moving in the dark. Beckett stood there a long moment, jaw tight, looking at the proof of it. Emmett Cade's words came back to him. A man that desperate for a deal to close don't always wait for the courts to decide things his way. He thought of Hargrove's face on the train platform, thought of Coltrane's calm, poisonous smile, thought of $200 offered like a bribe and a claim challenge filed like a threat, and now this, fire in the dark, aimed not at people maybe, but close enough to them that people could easily have died anyway. Something in Beckett went very still and very cold, because up until this point he'd been playing defense, absorbing every blow Hargrove threw, one at a time, patient, careful, hoping the man's ambition would run out of road before it ran out of patience. That hope was gone now, standing in the ash of his own barn. He walked back to the house. Sulin was on the porch, bandaged hand held carefully against her chest, watching him cross the yard with an expression that told him she already knew, somehow, exactly what he'd found. "It was them," she said. "Not a question. Coal oil. Boot prints outside the fence." His voice was flat, controlled, in the particular way a man's voice goes flat right before he stops being careful about consequences. "Somebody set that fire on purpose." She was quiet a moment. "Then we stop being only defense," she said. "We become also offense." He almost smiled, despite everything, despite the smoke still hanging low over the yard, and the ache in his shoulder where the horse had caught him, and the fear that had lived in his chest since the moment he'd watched her run toward the flames. "You've been reading my mind." "No." Her eyes were steady on his, fierce under the exhaustion. "I have been paying attention. Man like Hargrove, he thinks people like us are peace. Small, easy to move around aboard." Her jaw set. "We show him we are not pieces. We are the ones who write the rules he did not expect." Word of the fire moved through Larkspur faster than the smoke had cleared. By the second day, wagons had begun appearing at the edge of the property, unannounced. Neighbours Beckett barely knew by name, dropping off spare lumber, a coil of rope, a crate of nails nobody would accept payment for. Jeb Alsop himself rode out with a hind quarter of beef in the back of his wagon, muttering something about spoilage before anyone had to sell, before it went to waste. Though everybody present understood well enough that no such spoilage had actually threatened. It was Cora Norcross, in the end, who put words to what the whole town seemed to be feeling but hadn't yet said aloud. She arrived on the third morning, took one look at the burned skeleton of the barn, and turned to Su Lin with her jaw set in a way Beckett hadn't seen on her before. "Whoever did this," Cora said, "is going to answer for it. I don't care how much money he's got in that fine office of his. This town remembers who fed us soup when the doctor couldn't. It hasn't forgotten who threw a coin at your feet either." The following Sunday, what had begun as scattered wagons dropping off lumber had turned into something closer to an actual barn raising. A dozen families arriving before full light with tools and provisions, and the particular brisk efficiency of people who understood exactly what needed doing and simply set about doing it without waiting to be asked twice. Delphine Cross arrived with her husband and 2 grown sons, and greeted Su Lin not with the cautious distance of a stranger, but with the easy familiarity of someone continuing an argument they'd started weeks earlier at a churchyard pickle table. "Brought vinegar," Delphine announced, hauling a crate down from her wagon. "Figured you'd need it, whatever you're feeding this crowd, and I intend to watch you use it properly this time." Su Lin fed 30 people that day out of a kitchen meant for 2, an achievement Beckett would later describe to anyone who asked as something closer to a miracle than a meal, stretching what little she had into enough, the way she'd been doing with far less since the day he'd first brought her home. The framing went up fast with that many hands working it, beams raised and pegged before the worst heat of the afternoon set in, and Beckett found himself, more than once that day, simply standing back and watching the yard fill with the particular organized chaos of a community doing right by 2 of its own. Otis Pruitt brought his fiddle again, though nobody danced this time, the music instead becoming something to work by, a steady rhythm underneath the sound of hammers and saws. Jeb Alsop worked alongside his own sons, sweat soaking through his shirt by mid-morning, and at one point, pausing to drink from a dipper of well water, he looked out over the half-raised frame and said, mostly to himself but loud enough for Beckett to hear, "Should have done this weeks ago, should have done a lot of things weeks ago." He didn't elaborate, and Beckett didn't ask him to, understanding well enough that the apology, unspoken as it was, had already been received. By sundown the frame stood complete, raw and pale against the darkening sky, not yet a proper barn but unmistakably the bones of one, and Beckett stood in the yard watching it with Su Lin beside him, her hands raw from a full day of cooking and hauling water, her face tired in a way that looked, for the first time since he'd known her, entirely content rather than merely enduring. "They came," she said quietly, watching the last of the wagons pull away down the darkening road. "After everything, they still came. Told you this town gives things back," Beckett said. "Just does it sideways. Sideways is fine," Su Lin said, "so long as it comes." That afternoon, Emmett Cade rode out one more time. Didn't dismount. Didn't linger. Just tossed a folded paper down onto the porch steps, wheeled his horse, and rode off without a single word exchanged. Beckett unfolded it slowly. A copy hand-copied, in Emmett's own careful, even writing, of a contract. Terms between Walter Hargrove and a man named Prescott, dated 3 weeks before the train ever pulled into Larkspur. Terms for a rail spur route. Terms contingent on Hargrove delivering, in the language of the document itself, clean and unencumbered title to the parcel currently held by 1B Hollis. 3 weeks before the train, which meant the deal, the whole rotten architecture of it, The claim challenge, the buyout offer, maybe even the fire itself, had been in motion before Sulin had ever set foot on that platform. Before Hargrove had ever laid eyes on her, before any of this had started, in the way the town believed it had started, with a broken engagement and a wounded man's pride, it had never really been about her at all. It had been about this land sitting on a survey map in some office in Sacramento, and a woman's humiliation had simply been useful cover for a business deal that needed a clean story. Beckett sat down heavily on the porch step, the paper trembling slightly in his hand, not from fear this time, from something closer to fury, cold and absolute, the kind that doesn't burn hot and fade, but settles instead into bone and stays there. Sulin came to sit beside him. Read the paper over his shoulder, slow, careful, working through the unfamiliar legal language word by word. When she finished, she was very quiet. He would have done this, she said finally, even if I never came on that train. Yeah, even if I had dowry, even if I had gold. Her voice had gone hollow, and then, gradually, something harder replaced the hollowness. It was never about me being not enough. It was never even really about you refusing his money. She looked up at him, eyes bright and fierce in the fading afternoon light. It was only ever about this ground under our feet, and he was always going to try and take it. Beckett folded the paper carefully, tucked it inside his coat, next to the claim challenge letter, next to every other piece of paper Hargrove had used over the last 2 months, to try and dismantle a life that had only just started rebuilding itself. We make sure, he said, that he doesn't. That night, after the wound was redressed and the horses were settled in the makeshift shelter they'd cobbled together from what remained of the barn's undamaged corner, they sat together at the kitchen table with 2 things laid out between them: Emmett's copied contract, Sulin's careful ledger, its pages slightly warped now from smoke and rain, but every entry still legible. 2 pieces of paper, one proving intent, one proving truth. Judge Norcross, Beckett said slowly, turning the idea over as he spoke it. His wife owes you her health. That's not nothing out here. And he came out here himself last week to say as much. He is fair, man? Fairer than most. And he doesn't much care for men who think money buys them out of the rules. Everybody else has to follow. Beckett looked at the 2 papers on the table, side by side, small and thin and entirely unequal on paper, to the wealth and power arrayed against them. Might not be enough. Hargrove's got friends, got money for lawyers we can't match. Maybe. Sulin's uninjured hand rested flat on the ledger, steady, certain. But we have proof. We have truth. And we have, she paused, searching, then found the word and held on to it. We have town. Town that is starting to remember who fed them soup when doctor could not. Town that is starting to remember who threw coin at woman like she was nothing. Beckett looked at her a long moment. Firelight moving soft across her face, bandaged hand resting on evidence she'd nearly died to save, spine still straight despite everything the last 3 months had thrown at her. He thought about the train platform, about a man who'd measured her worth in gold and found her lacking. He never had a clue what he threw away, Beckett said quietly. Sulin looked up at him. Something soft moved behind her eyes, something that had nothing to do with land claims or railroad contracts or the fight still waiting for them on the other side of this night. Neither did you, she said. At first. On platform. You did not know either. No, Beckett admitted. Thought I was hiring a cook. And now, the question hung there in the lamplight, simple and enormous at once. Beckett reached across the table. Careful of her bandaged hand, he covered her good one with his own, rough palm against smaller, steadier fingers. Now, he said, I know exactly what I've got, and I'm not about to let any man take it from me. Not the land, not you, not any of it. Outside, the last of the storm clouds broke apart across a sky gone clear and star-scattered, and somewhere out in the dark, past the smoking ruin of a barn and the long road back to town, a fight neither of them had chosen was waiting to be finished. But for tonight, in the small warm circle of lamplight, 2 people who had each lost everything once before sat together at a table, hands joined, and understood, without needing to say it out loud, that whatever came next, they would not be facing it alone. Larkspur, Nevada, 1882. The meeting was set for Saturday, Judge Norcross's doing, not Beckett's. Because word of the fire had already reached him, word travelled fast in Larkspur, faster still when it involved a barn burning down 10 miles out on a stormy night and a woman running into the flames to save a notebook. And Elias Norcross, whatever else he was, had not built a reputation as a fair-minded county judge by ignoring things that smelled wrong. So he called for a public hearing, Town Hall, Saturday noon. The land claim challenge, laid out plain, in front of anyone who cared to come and watch. Which, in a town the size of Larkspur, meant everyone. Coltrane came to the homestead first, alone this time. No hired muscle riding shotgun beside him, just the lawyer himself, sitting his horse at the fence line with an expression that had lost some of its earlier polish. Beckett walked out to meet him. Sue Celine stood on the porch, bandaged hand still healing, watching. Mr. Hollis. Coltrane's voice had gone careful, measuring. Before Saturday, I think it's only fair to remind you of something. Go on, this woman. Coltrane's eyes flicked toward the porch, toward Sue Lin, and something in the way he said, woman, made Beckett's jaw tighten. She is not your wife. Legally speaking, she is a house guest, an employee perhaps if we're being generous. So, Coltrane let the word hang there, savouring it. There is a new federal law, Mr. Hollis, signed this very year, restricting Chinese immigration into this country rather severely. A woman with no legal standing here, no marriage, no sponsor, no clear claim to residency, becomes a very complicated question for the authorities to sort out, especially if certain parties were to bring her situation to their attention. Beckett went very still, because it was one thing to threaten his land, his claim, even his life in the dark corner of a barn fire. It was another thing entirely to threaten to take her away. Not with fists, not with fire, with paper and law and the particular cruelty of a system that didn't care whose life it dismantled, as long as the forms were filled in correctly. You'd do that, Beckett said, low, report her, just to win a land dispute. I would do, Coltrane said, whatever Mr. Hargrove instructs me to do, as would you, Mr. Hollis, if your livelihood depended on it. He gathered his reins. Saturday noon. I'd think carefully about what you're prepared to defend and what you're prepared to lose defending it. He rode off, and Beckett stood there in the yard with a new kind of fear settling cold into his chest, not fear for the land any more. Fear for her. He told her everything that night. Watched her face while he did it, because he'd promised himself he wouldn't hide things from her again. Not after the fire. Not after watching her run toward flames, rather than lose the one piece of proof standing between them and ruin. She was quiet a long time when he finished. So, she said finally, even if we win land, he can still take me away with different paper, not if I can help it. Beckett, her voice was steady, but something underneath it had gone thin, stretched. This is not fence line, not barn. This is law, whole country's law. You cannot fight law with shotgun. No, he met her eyes, but maybe I can fight it with a ring. She went very still. What, marry me? The words came out rougher than he intended. None of the careful romance a man was supposed to bring to a moment like this, just plain and urgent and true. Not because of Coltrane, not because of some paper trying to take you away. He took a breath. Because I already know what I've got standing in front of me. Have known it for a while now, and I'm not about to let a man like Hargrove be the reason I never got around to saying so. Suline's hand, the good one, unburned, pressed briefly against her mouth, like she was holding something in. You ask this, she said slowly, in middle of fire of fear and lawyer threats. Wish I could have picked a prettier moment. No. Something broke loose in her voice, warm underneath the wet shine gathering in her eyes. This is right moment. Because this is real. Not like train platform. Not like man who only wanted gold. She stepped closer. You are not asking because law makes you. You are asking anyway. Yeah, then yes. She said it simply, the same way she'd said I can cook, months ago, on a different porch, in a different kind of dark. Yes, Beckett Hollis, I marry you. He didn't have a ring yet. That would come later, at the wedding itself, but neither of them knew that on this particular night. He took her hand anyway, the good one, and held it like a promise didn't need a piece of metal to be real, and for one long moment, standing in the yard with a burned-out barn behind them, and a hearing 3 days off, and half a county's worth of trouble bearing down, neither one of them thought about anything except the fact that they'd just decided together to face all of it as one thing instead of two. The night before the hearing, neither of them slept much. Beckett sat at the kitchen table long after the lamp should have been put out, going over the two documents again and again, the ledger and the copied contract, as though enough repetition might reveal some weakness he'd missed, some way Coltrane could still turn the evidence against them despite everything. Sulin found him there past midnight, and instead of urging him to bed, sat down across from him and began, without a word, to go through the ledger's pages one final time herself, checking dates against her own memory, making certain every entry could withstand whatever scrutiny Coltrane intended to bring. "You're frightened," she said eventually, not looking up from the pages. "Wouldn't call it frightened. I would." She glanced up, steady, unoffended. "I am frightened too, no shame in it. Only foolish men pretend fear does not visit them before a fight worth having." Beckett let out a breath he'd been holding for what felt like hours. A man like Hargrove's got money enough to buy better lawyers than Coltrane if this one fails him. Got friends I don't even know about yet, probably. We walk in there tomorrow with a burned notebook and a piece of paper Emmett, copied out by hand, and somehow that's supposed to be enough to bring down everything he's spent years building. "It does not need to be enough to bring down everything," Sulin said. "Only enough to bring down the lie he told about this land. The rest he will bring down himself. Men like that always do eventually, if you only give truth enough room to stand. You sound awful certain for a woman who was thrown off a train platform by the same kind of certainty 6 months ago." "I am not certain," Sulin said. "I am simply more tired of being frightened than I am of trying." She reached across the table, closing the ledger gently, and set her hand over his the way he had once set his over hers. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we walk in together. That is already more than I had, standing alone on that platform. Whatever the judge decides, I do not lose that." They sat together a while longer in the lamplight, not speaking, the ledger and the contract squared neatly on the table between them, and eventually, come time past 2, exhaustion finally won out over fear, and they slept, for a few short hours, side by side in chairs neither of them had meant to fall asleep in, waking stiff-necked and heavy-eyed to a dawn that would decide, one way or another, whether everything they'd built together these past months would be allowed to stand. Saturday came clear and bright, the kind of high-desert morning that made trouble feel almost unreasonable, given how blue the sky was. The town hall filled fast, every bench taken, people standing along the back wall, spilling out the open door into the yard beyond. Beckett had never seen the building this full, not for a barn dance, not for a Sunday sermon, not for anything. He and Sulin arrived early, before the crowd thickened, and sat near the front in a silence that had none of the awkwardness of their first wagon ride together. This silence was something else entirely, a held breath they were sharing on purpose. Hargrove arrived last. Deliberately, Beckett suspected, a man who liked to make an entrance, liked the room to feel his absence before it felt his presence. He wore his finest coat, walked in like he already owned the outcome. Coltrane trailed a step behind him, papers in hand. Judge Norcross took his seat at the front, gavel resting untouched beside him, and let the room settle before he spoke. "This hearing concerns a challenge filed against the homestead claim of Beckett Hollis." His voice carried, flat and formal, across the packed room, filed anonymously. Citing improper procedure and insufficient improvement of the land, he looked out over the crowd, eyes finding Hargrove for just a beat too long to be accidental. "We'll hear the challenge first." Coltrane rose, made his case smooth and practiced dates, technicalities, a fence line supposedly 2 feet short of requirement, a filing form supposedly missing a signature from 6 years back. It sounded, on its surface, almost reasonable, except reasonable wasn't the same as true. When Coltrane finished, Judge Norcross turned to Beckett. "Mr. Hollis, your response." Beckett stood. His hands weren't quite steady, and he let them not be steady, because pretending otherwise in a room this full would have been its own kind of lie. "I've got 6 years of work on that land," he said. "Fence posts I sunk myself, a well I dug by hand, a house I built with lumber I hauled 10 miles by wagon." He paused, "but instead of telling you about it, I'd rather show you." Jeb Alsop stood up from the third bench before Beckett had even finished, hat already in his hands. "I'll speak to that, if the court allows," Jeb said. "Sold that man lumber and nails for 6 years running, watched him haul every board out of my own store himself, 1 wagon load at a time, because he couldn't afford to pay a freight man to do it for him. Whatever's written on that challenge, it isn't the truth of what I've seen with my own eyes." Judge Norcross nodded slowly. "Noted, Mr. Alsop. Thank you." Otis Pruett rose next, twisting his hat in both hands, clearly unused to speaking in front of a crowd this size. Rode out to that property myself the night of the fire, saw the fences, saw the well, saw a garden that woman built out of dirt I wouldn't have bet $1 would grow anything at all. Ain't a man in this room could call that unimproved land with a straight face. Coltrane rose halfway out of his seat. Your Honour, these are character statements, not evidence. They're testimony from residents of this county. Norcross said, is precisely what a hearing of this nature is for. Sit down, Mr. Coltrane. A murmur of agreement moved through the room, quiet but unmistakable, and Beckett felt something in his chest loosen just slightly, the way it had loosened once before, months ago, the sound of silk moving through dust behind him. He nodded toward the back of the room. Sulene walked forward. The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Not the polite hush of a formal hearing, but something more curious, more charged, because half the people in that room had eaten her food, had watched Cora Norcross walk straighter and laugh louder than she had in 2 years, and the other half had at some point over the last 2 months heard the whispers about the woman thrown off a train platform and taken in by a rancher with more conscience than sense. She set the ledger down on the table in front of the judge, opened it. Pages slightly warped from smoke and rain, but every entry legible, dates, yields, sketches of the garden's expansion season by season, careful records of every improvement made to the land since the day she'd arrived. This shows, she said, her English steady despite the size of the room, despite every eye on her, work done on this land. Not just by Mr. Hollis, by both of us. Together, a murmur ran through the crowd. Judge Norcross leaned forward, studying the pages with the particular attention of a man who took paperwork seriously, even when the world around him didn't. This is remarkably thorough, Miss Meng. I keep careful records, she said simply. It is what my family does, what my family always does. Coltrane rose before Beckett could speak, circling toward the table with the careful, predatory patience of a man accustomed to finding weaknesses in testimony. A remarkable ledger indeed, Miss Meng. Tell me, who else can attest to the accuracy of these entries? Who witnessed you recording them? No one, Sulene said simply. I write alone, in evening. Same as your law books are written alone, I assume, by clerks nobody stood over while they worked. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room. Coltrane's jaw tightened. So we have only your word, he pressed, for dates that happen to align rather conveniently with your own arrival here. You have my word, Sulene agreed, and you have garden itself, still growing outside, which anyone in this room may walk out and see for themselves this very afternoon. Ledger did not grow those vegetables, Mr. Coltrane, only records what already grew. Convenient that the one piece of evidence supporting your claim happens to be edible and therefore unable to testify to its own planting date. Also convenient, Sulene said, without missing a beat, that the one piece of evidence supporting your claim happens to be an anonymous filing, unable to explain who filed it or why they wish to remain unnamed while doing so. The laughter this time was louder, and Judge Norcross did not immediately call for order, allowing it to run its course with the faint, unhidden satisfaction of a man enjoying watching a lawyer lose ground to a witness he'd clearly underestimated. Coltrane, flushed now, tried once more. Regardless of the garden's authenticity, a garden alone does not satisfy the improvement requirements of the Homestead Act. Fencing, permanent structures, water access fence you may inspect yourself, north and south, both mended by Mr. Hollis's own hands. Sulene, calm and unhurried. Well, you already know exists. Since your own client's man once stood beside it, making threats, I am certain the sheriff would find equally interesting to hear about. And structures, she gestured toward the window, toward the half-raised frame of the new barn visible beyond it, built by half this county over the course of a single Sunday. That, too, you may inspect. Though I suspect, Mr. Coltrane, you have already seen enough evidence today to satisfy any honest man's questions. Coltrane opened his mouth, closed it, retreated to his seat without further comment, and Judge Norcross allowed himself the ghost of a smile before continuing. I believe, Norcross said, we've heard sufficient testimony on the matter of improvements. Mr. Hollis, you may proceed. Then Beckett stepped forward and laid the second document beside the ledger, Emmett Cade's copied contract. This, Beckett said, is a copy of an agreement between Mr. Hargrove and an investor named Prescott. dated 3 weeks before the train that brought Mist's men to Larkspur ever pulled into this town. He let that land a moment before continuing. It lays out a deal for a rail spur route, a route that happens to run straight through my land. A deal contingent on Mr. Hargrove delivering clear title. The room had gone very still now, which means, Beckett said, this claim challenge was never about my fence lines or my paperwork. It was about clearing me off land, Mr. Hargrove had already promised to somebody else, weeks before he ever met the woman he later blamed for all of it. Hargrove was on his feet now, face flushed dark. This is slander. Fabrication. That document is worthless. You could have written it yourself. Could have, Beckett agreed. Didn't. Prove it then. Hargrove's voice cracked slightly with the effort of staying composed. Prove any of it. That was when Cora Norcross stood up. The room turned toward her, surprised. A judge's wife did not typically insert herself into her husband's official proceedings, and everyone in that room knew it, including Cora herself, whose hands were visibly trembling even as she stayed on her feet. I can prove part of it, she said. Judge Norcross's expression shifted, quick and involuntary, something between concern and warning. Cora, no Elias. Her voice, though shaking, didn't waver in its intent. They need to hear this. She turned to face the room, faced Hargrove directly. 3 weeks ago, Mr. Hargrove came to our home, she said, while Elias was reviewing the land office's initial paperwork on this very claim. Mr. Hargrove offered him money, a great deal of money, to expedite the ruling in his favor. The room erupted into noise, low at first, then rising, a wave of murmurs and gasps rolling from the front benches to the back wall. Judge Norcross's gavel came down once, sharp. Order, the room quieted, but the energy in it had shifted completely, a current running through the crowd that hadn't been there a moment before. I refused the money, obviously, Judge Norcross said, voice tight with a fury he was visibly working to control. And I should have reported the attempt immediately. I did not. He stopped, started again, out of a foolish hope that it wouldn't matter, that the facts would speak for themselves regardless. I was wrong to stay silent. I recognize that now, in front of all of you. He looked at Hargrove, and whatever careful neutrality a judge was supposed to maintain had entirely burned away. Attempted bribery of a sitting judge, he said, a serious matter, Mr. Hargrove. Combined with clear evidence of premeditated intent behind this claim challenge, I am dismissing it. In full, effective immediately. The room broke into sound again, this time closer to something like triumph, scattered applause rippling through the crowd before Norcross's gavel silenced it. Jeb Alston, 3 rows back, had risen halfway from his seat without seeming to notice he'd done it, applauding loud enough that his own wife had to tug his sleeve to remind him where he was. Delphine Cross had turned to the woman beside her, gripping her arm, saying something Beckett couldn't hear but could read easily enough in the shape of her mouth. Something like I told you, something like knew it all along, the particular satisfaction of a woman who'd decided months ago which side of a story she believed and had just been proven right in front of the entire county. Hargroves stood frozen at the front of the room, face gone pale beneath the flush of a moment ago, and for the first time since the train platform, Beckett watched the man's composure crack entirely open. It should have ended there, except it didn't, because a man like Hargrove, cornered in front of the entire town he'd spent years lording over, didn't simply sit down quietly and accept defeat. You think this changes anything? His voice rose, ragged at the edges, aimed now less at the judge and more at the room itself, like he was trying to claw back some version of the control he'd just lost. You think a burned notebook and a hysterical woman's accusation undoes years of what I've built in this county? Walter! Coltrane's voice, low, urgent, a warning his own lawyer was giving him now. Sit down. Hargrove didn't sit down. I built this town's cattle trade. I brought money here that half of you have profited from, whether you'll admit it or not. He was breathing hard now, some dam inside him finally giving way after weeks of careful, controlled cruelty, and I will not be lectured by a farmer and his house guest about what I have or haven't earned. It was Emmett Cadd who answered him. He'd been standing near the back of the room, hat in hand, quiet through the whole hearing. Now he stepped forward into the open aisle, and every head in the room turned to follow him. Funny thing about earning, Walter. Emmett's voice was calm, almost gentle, which made what came next land harder. I've been your foreman 6 years. kept your books more than once when your bookkeeper was out sick. He reached into his coat, produced a folded paper of his own. This past spring, I found something in those books I wasn't supposed to see. Hargrove's face went from pale to grey in the space of a breath. Emmett, don't! You're mortgaged to the hilt, Walter. Emmett's voice carried clean across the silent room. Every acre of that cattle operation you just bragged about, borrowed against. 3 times over to fund this railroad gamble with Prescott. You don't have money, Walter. You have debt wearing a fine coat. He set the paper down on the table beside the other 2 documents. You threw a woman off a train platform for not bringing enough gold to a marriage, and the whole time you didn't have 2 nickels to rub together that weren't already owed to somebody else. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Beckett had ever heard in a room full of people, because there it was, the whole shape of it laid bare in front of the entire town at once, a man who'd built his reputation on wealth he didn't actually possess. A man who'd humiliated a woman publicly for the crime of arriving without a fortune, while standing there himself with nothing underneath his fine coat but borrowed money and a gambler's desperation. The mirror of it was almost too clean to be real, except it was real, every page of it sitting right there on the table. Hargrove's mouth opened, closed, opened again, searching for some version of denial that might still hold up in a room full of witnesses. Nothing came. And that was when the door at the back of the hall opened, and a man none of the townsfolk recognized stepped inside, well-dressed, travel-worn, an expression of controlled distaste already settling over his face before he'd said a single word. Mr. Hargrove. The man's voice was clipped, Eastern-moneyed, entirely unimpressed with what he was walking into. I came out early for our final survey meeting. I can see now that was a mistake. Hargrove's face drained the rest of the way to white. Prescott, I've heard enough standing in that doorway, Prescott said, to know exactly what kind of man I've been doing business with. He looked around the room, at the ledger, at the copied contract, at the crowd of witnesses, and something like disgust flickered across his features. Attempted bribery of a judge, fraudulent land claims, and apparently arson if half of what I overheard on my way in is accurate. That's not... Hargrove started. I don't care to hear your version, Mr. Hargrove. Prescott's voice cut clean through the room. My investors do not put their money behind men involved in scandal. The rail spur deal is dead. Effective this moment. He turned, already moving back toward the door. I'll expect my initial deposit returned within the month, through proper legal channels this time, not whatever arrangement you'd been counting on. He left as abruptly as he'd arrived, and the silence he left behind him was, if anything, even heavier than before. Hargrove stood alone at the front of the room. His lawyer had gone quiet beside him. His foreman had just publicly gutted him with his own books. His investor had just walked out the door with the last of his fortune's future going with him. Everything he'd built the last months of cruelty around, the land, the money, the deal that was supposed to make him untouchable, had just come apart in the space of about 90 seconds in front of every person in Larkspur who'd ever had reason to fear him. Judge Norcross let the silence hold a moment longer before he spoke again. This hearing is concluded, he said. The claim against Mr. Hollis's homestead is dismissed, with prejudice given clear evidence of fraudulent and coercive intent behind its filing. He turned his gaze to Hargrove, and his voice carried the particular weight of a man who had, for once, stopped being careful about consequences. Mr. Hargrove, I'd strongly advise you retain separate counsel of your own before I decide whether further charges are warranted regarding the bribery attempt, the fire at the Hollis property, which I expect the sheriff will now be looking into rather closely. Sheriff Garrett Voss, who'd been standing quiet near the door through the entire hearing, stepped forward at that, and something in the set of his shoulders made it clear exactly how closely he intended to look. Walter Hargrove, Voss said, I'll be wanting a word with you before you leave town today, and every day after, until this fire's been properly looked into. Hargrove didn't wait for the rest of it. He turned, walked out of the hall alone, past rows of people who had once tipped their hats to him out of habit and fear, and now simply watched him go with the particular flat silence a town saves for someone it's finished with. Coltrane gathered his papers and followed a moment later, not quite fast enough to avoid looking exactly like what he was, a man abandoning a sinking ship the instant it started taking on water. Emmett Cade found Beckett in the thinning crowd outside the hall, still holding his hat in both hands, looking like a man who wasn't entirely sure what he'd just done to his own life off. "Reckon I'm out of a job," Emmett said, with a short, humorless laugh. "A man doesn't generally keep his foreman on after that foreman hands the whole county proof he's broke." "You did right by us today," Beckett said. "Whatever it costs you. Didn't do it for free, if that's what you're worried about." Emmett managed a thin smile. Norcross mentioned, before the hearing even started, that a ranch 2 valleys over is looking for a foreman who actually knows cattle instead of just knowing how to look the part. "Seems word of my particular talents travelled faster than I expected." He shrugged, though something loosened visibly in his shoulders as he said it, months of tension finally allowed to unclench. "Guess honesty pays out slower than a paycheck, but it pays out somehow. Judge put in a word for you. Didn't have to, just mentioned it offhand like it wasn't a favour at all." Emmett looked back toward the hall, toward the door Hargrove had just walked out of alone, unaccompanied, a man who'd once commanded a small army of hired hands, now leaving town with nobody troubling themselves to see him off. Strange thing, watching a man like that lose everything in the time it takes to eat a church supper. Wasn't near as satisfying as I thought it might be. No? Man's still got his health, his name such as it's worth now. Some men you take away their money and their pride, and it turns out that's all they ever really had. I find I mostly just feel sorry for him, now that it's done. Emmett settled his hat back onto his head. "Don't mistake me. Wouldn't take a minute of it back. Just didn't expect the taste of it to be quite this plain." He shook Beckett's hand, firm, final, a handshake of 2 men, closing out a debt that had started years earlier at the bottom of a flooded creek, and had finally, that afternoon, been paid in full. "You'll come to the wedding," Beckett said, "whenever we manage to arrange it." "Wouldn't miss it," Emmett said, "even if I have to borrow a decent coat to do it in." Within the month, word came back through Sheriff Voss that Hargrove had sold what remained of his holdings, what wasn't already claimed by creditors, and left the county entirely, the investigation into the fire still open behind him, a debt he would carry with him regardless of how far he rode. He went the way he'd once made Sulin leave that train platform alone, without ceremony, without anyone troubling themselves to watch him go. Nobody threw a coin at his feet on his way out. Nobody needed to. The town's silence did the work well enough on its own. Voss rode out to the homestead himself a week after Hargrove's departure to close the matter properly. Found the coal oil merchant who sold it, Voss said, standing at the fence line with his hat pushed back, looking more satisfied than his usual careful neutrality generally allowed. Fella in the next county over remembered the purchase clear enough, on account of the buyer paying extra to keep the sale quiet. Matched the description to one of Hargrove's hired men easy enough once I started asking around. He confessed to it? Man in his position, hired muscle with no loyalty left to a boss who'd already skipped town without paying his last wages, confesses to near anything once he understands there's nobody left worth staying quiet for. Voss allowed himself a thin, grim smile. Got a signed statement naming Hargrove as the one who ordered it, filed it with the county same day. Won't undo the barn you lost, but it closes the book properly, for anyone who might have wondered whether justice was only ever going to reach halfway. "Appreciate you seeing it through," Beckett said. Wasn't going to leave it half-finished. Voss looked out at the new barn frame, further along now than it had been the week before, more hands having turned out to help raise it further. County's better with men like Hargrove gone from it, Hollis. Better with families like yours settled into it instead. Figured that was worth the extra riding. He tipped his hat toward the house towards Sulin, visible briefly in the doorway, and rode off, leaving behind him the particular satisfaction of a debt properly closed rather than merely abandoned. Beckett found Sulin outside, on the steps of the town hall, breathing in the clean afternoon air like she was testing whether it tasted different now than it had an hour ago. "It's over," he said, still not quite believing it himself. "Land, yes." She looked at him. "Other thing. Coltrane's threat, about law, about who is allowed to stay. That's why we're getting married," he said gently. "Not the only reason, but it settles that too. Nobody's got grounds to question your place here once you're my wife. Not Coltrane. Not anybody, not now that he's gone. Anyway, she was quiet a moment, looking out over the crowd, still filtering out of the hall behind them, murmuring to each other, some of them glancing over with expressions that had shifted, in the space of one afternoon, from cautious curiosity to something closer to respect. "Good," she said finally, "because I did not come across ocean to be sent back over technicality. I came to build something, and I am not finished building it." They were married 3 weeks later on a clear Sunday afternoon in the yard in front of the half-finished new barn. It hadn't been Beckett's idea to make it a town affair. He'd pictured something small, just the two of them and Judge Norcross, and whatever words the law required. Cora Norcross had heard about the date and simply arrived 4 days early with a wagon-load of borrowed chairs, and after that the thing had taken on a momentum entirely its own. Neighbors came from as far as 20 miles out. Jeb Alsop closed the general store for the afternoon, the first time in 6 years anyone could remember him doing so, and brought a crate of good coffee as a gift, refusing payment with a gruffness that barely covered how pleased he was to be asked. Otis Pruitt brought his fiddle, tuning it in the shade of the porch with the fussy concentration of a man who took the instrument more seriously than he let on. Emmett Cade rode in, wearing a coat Beckett had never seen him in before, looking so uncomfortable in his own collar that soon laughed at him openly, which seemed to relax him more than anything else could have. Sulin had spent 2 days cooking, refusing all offers of help beyond a few extra hands to haul water and tend the fire, because this, she said, was the one thing she knew exactly how to give a room full of people who had, in their own slow and stubborn way, finally decided to welcome her. The tables groaned under dishes half the guests had no name for, and every one of them kept coming back to anyway. Spiced pork and fragrant rice and a soup Cora Norcross declared, loudly and to general agreement, the finest thing she'd ever eaten in this county or any other. That morning, before the first wagons had even started arriving, Cora Norcross had appeared at the homestead with a basket over one arm and the brisk, determined energy of a woman who considered wedding preparation a personal responsibility she intended to see done properly. "Sit," Cora instructed, setting the basket down and producing a hairbrush with the air of someone who would not be argued with. "I don't care how capable you are with a stove or a ledger or a shotgun apparently, which I've heard all about from Beckett and intend to ask you more on later. A woman does not do her own hair on her wedding day. It simply isn't done." Sulin, more amused than obedient, and let Cora work the brush through her hair in long, careful strokes. "You did not have to come so early," Sulin said. "I wanted to." Cora's voice had gone quieter, less brisk. 2 years I couldn't leave my own kitchen most days. Couldn't imagine standing this long, let alone fussing over somebody else's hair before dawn. She met Sulin's eyes in the small mirror propped against the wall. "I don't say thank you near often enough. Elias says the same. You gave me back years I thought I'd already lost. The least I can do is make sure you look the way you deserve to look today." "The broth did small part," Sulin said. "You did the harder part, kept coming back, kept believing something could change. Suppose we managed it together then." Cora pinned the last of Sulin's hair into place, then reached into her basket and produced a small spray of dried wildflowers, the same stubborn purple blooms that grew wild along every fencer's line in the county, for your hair. "Didn't think roses would suit you nearly as well as something that actually survives out here." Sulin touched the flowers gently, throat tight in a way that had nothing to do with sadness. "They are perfect." "Of course they are," Cora said, satisfied, stepping back to admire her work. "Now, let's get you into that green dress before Beckett Hollis wears a trench in his own front yard from pacing." Sulin wore green that day, not pink. She had thought about the pink silk more than once in the weeks leading up to the wedding, and had decided finally that it belonged to a different chapter of her life, the one where she'd needed to be seen before she'd had the chance to be known. She didn't need announcing any more. The whole town already knew exactly who she was. Judge Norcross spoke the words plainly, the way he did everything, and when it came time for the ring, Beckett reached into his coat and drew out the one he'd been shaping in secret evenings for weeks. A plain band worked from an old horseshoe nail, hammered smooth and thin by his own hands, polished until it caught the afternoon light like it had every right to shine as bright as anything bought from a jeweller's case. Norcross had insisted, before the ceremony began, on completing the marriage certificate himself rather than leaving it to a county clerk's later convenience, filing it that same afternoon with his own hand rather than trusting it to the mail. Coltrane's threat may have left with Hargrove. He'd told Beckett quietly beforehand, but paperwork done properly is paperwork no future Coltrane can ever use against you. Best this is settled beyond any question today while the whole county's here to witness it. It was a small, practical kindness, the sort Norcross seemed to specialize in, and it meant that by the time the ceremony itself began, the matter Coltrane had once used as a weapon had already been closed as thoroughly as the law allowed. No, it isn't much, he said, low enough that it was really only meant for her, though half the yard leaned in to hear it anyway. Made it myself, paid for with money from the first vegetables we sold in town, he swallowed. But this land, it isn't just mine anymore, hasn't been for a while now, if I'm honest. It's ours, has been since the day you first swept that floor like you already belonged here. Su Lin looked at the ring, then at his face, and whatever hesitation might have lived in her once, the wariness of a woman who'd learned the hard way that kindness could wear a costume, none of it was there any more. Just a deep, steady warmth that had been building quietly for months, waiting for exactly this moment to finally show itself in full. She held out her hand to the one still faintly marked, pale and thin, where the burn had healed, and let him slide the ring onto her finger. Yes, she said again, the same word, the same certainty, in front of a whole town this time instead of an empty yard. Yes, Beckett Hollis. The cheer that went up startled a flock of birds off the fence line. Emmett Cade let out a whoop entirely unbefitting a man in an uncomfortable new collar, and Otis Pruitt struck up something quick and bright on the fiddle before the applause had even fully settled, as though he'd simply run out of patience waiting for a proper cue. Jeb Alsop stood to offer a toast partway through the meal, awkward with the unfamiliar formality of it, clearing his throat twice before he managed to get the words out. Known Beckett Hollis going on 7 years, Jeb said, raising a battered tin cup. Watched him go quiet after he lost Charlotte, and I'll admit some of us in town figured that quiet was just how he'd stay. Didn't know a woman thrown off a train platform would be the one to prove us wrong. He looked at Su Lin, and something in his weathered face softened considerably. Glad to be proven wrong. Don't say that, Offerton. To Beckett and Su Lin Hollis. To Beckett and Su Lin, the yard echoed back. Glasses and cups raised against the golden afternoon light, and for the rest of that day the homestead that had once known nothing but silence and dust and a widower's grief rang instead with fiddle music and laughter and the particular unmistakable warmth of a community that had finally, fully decided to claim 2 of its own. Delphine Cross cornered Su Lin near the dessert table partway through the afternoon, inspecting the spread with the proprietary interest of a woman who considered herself, by now, something of an authority on Su Lin's cooking. That soup, Delphine announced, is better than the one you made me at the social. What'd you change? Nothing changed, Su Lin said, only cooked longer. Patience, mostly, patience. Delphine snorted, not unkindly. Suppose that tracks, given everything you've had to be patient through this past year. She glanced toward Beckett, currently being backed into a corner by Otis Pruitt's insistence on a second dance, and something in her weathered face softened. Man looks happier today than I've seen him look in 7 years of knowing him. You did that. Whatever else this county owes you, it owes you thanks for that alone. Sheriff Voss made an appearance too, brief and characteristically unceremonious, offering a handshake to Beckett and a nod to Su Lin before declining twice Cora's insistence that he stay for supper. Got rounds to make, Voss said, but wanted to see this for myself. Man doesn't get many chances in this line of work to watch a story end better than it started. He tipped his hat towards Su Lin. Glad this one did, Mrs. Hollis. It was the first time anyone had used the name aloud, and Su Lin felt it settle over her like the last piece of something long unfinished finally sliding into place. They danced once, clumsily. Neither of them practiced at it, Beckett leading with more determination than grace, and Su Lin laughing outright at his missteps until she gave up trying to follow any proper pattern and simply moved with him instead, the 2 of them turning slow circles in the dust, while half the county looked on with a particular fondness reserved for people who have earned, the hard way, exactly the happiness now visible on their faces. Late that autumn, with the new barn finished and the garden gone gold and rust-coloured with the turning season, Beckett stood in the doorway one evening and watched Su Lin move through the kitchen the way he'd watched her that very first night, economical, certain, entirely at home in a space that had once been nothing but dust and silence, except now there was more to it than survival. Now there was laughter drifting in from the porch, where a handful of neighbours sat waiting on supper, a standing arrangement that had, without either of them quite deciding it on purpose, become a Sunday habit the whole nearby stretch of the valley had come to expect. Now there was a ring on her hand that caught the lamplight every time she reached for a pot. Now there was a life built not out of desperation or obligation, but out of two people who'd looked at everything the world had thrown at them and decided, together, to build something better out of the wreckage anyway. What had started as broth for a judge's wife had grown, slowly and without any real planning behind it, to something Su Lin had begun calling, half-joking, a second kitchen, a standing arrangement with Jeb Alsop that let her sell preserved vegetables and small clay jars of spice, blends out of a corner of the general store on Saturdays, the same corner where a coin had once been thrown at her feet, not a mile from where she now stood taking payment for her own family's recipes, honestly earned, freely given. It was Jeb himself who'd suggested it, gruffly, the way he suggested most things, sliding a spare shelf her way one afternoon without much ceremony. "Half this county's been asking after your spice jars since the wedding," he'd said. "Might as well make a business of it instead of giving it all away for free out of that kitchen of yours." Su Lin had laughed at him, but she'd taken the shelf anyway. And within 2 months the corner had become one of the store's steadier draws, ranch wives and miners' families alike stopping by to trade for something they'd never once expected to find in a Nevada general store. A letter had come too, near the end of summer, from a family 2 counties over, recent arrivals from Su Lin's own province, struggling to find their footing in a territory that had not been especially kind to them either. Su Lin had written back the same week, in her careful, improving English, alongside careful brushstroke characters, offering what she could, seed for the coming season, recipes translated as best she was able, and an open invitation to visit the homestead should the road ever bring them near Larkspur. "You do not know these people," Beckett had pointed out, not objecting, only curious. "I did not know you either," Su Lin had said. Man across the street loading feed sacks. Turned out to be everything. She'd folded the letter carefully before sealing it. Sometimes the only way to repay a kindness this large is to make sure it does not stop with you. He thought about that train platform sometimes. Still did, even now. Thought about a man who'd stood there in his fine coat, so certain of his own worth and so wrong about hers, never once understanding that the thing he was throwing away that day couldn't have been bought with all the money in his ledgers combined. Thought about how close he himself had come to walking right past it, loading his feed sacks, minding his own business, letting the world go on being cruel without him in the middle of it. He was glad every single day since that he hadn't. Su Lin looked up from the stove, caught him watching, smiled, the same genuine smile she'd first given him on a porch step months ago, the night she'd told him, "Yes, I can cook," and meant so much more by it than either of them had understood at the time. "Supper is almost ready," she said. "I know," Beckett said, crossing the room toward her. "Smells like home," and for the first time in longer than he could properly measure, that word didn't ache going down. It simply fit.